Chapter 1. Before Minnesota was Minnesota. Long before there was a place called Minnesota, before cities like Minneapolis or St. Paul, before farms, railroads, and highways. The land that would one day become the North Star State was a world shaped by forces almost impossible to imagine today. It was a land of ice and giants, a landscape molded not by human hands, but by the slow, relentless power of glaciers that moved across the continent like frozen rivers. To understand Minnesota's history, one must begin not with people, but with the ice. Around 2 million years ago, during what scientists call the Ice Age, enormous sheets of ice began to spread south from the Arctic regions of North America. These glaciers were not small patches of frost or thin layers of snow. They were vast mountains of ice, in some places more than a mile thick. Over thousands of years, they crept slowly across the land, grinding mountains into dust and reshaping the earth beneath them. Minnesota lay directly in the path of several of these massive glaciers. As the ice advanced, it acted like a colossal bulldozer. Rocks, gravel, sand, and entire hills were pushed along beneath the frozen mass. Valleys were scraped deeper, ridges were flattened, and new landforms were created wherever the ice moved. The pressure was so great that bedrock itself was carved and polished. Then, just as slowly as the glaciers had come, they began to retreat. Around 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, the climate of North America began to warm. The ice sheets that had dominated the northern half of the continent for thousands of years started to melt. Enormous rivers of water poured to southward as the glaciers shrank. Lakes formed in the depressions left behind by the retreating ice. Rivers changed course, carving new valleys as they flowed toward the sea. Minnesota's famous landscape was born during this dramatic transformation. The state is often called the land of 10,000 lakes, though in reality it contains more than 11,000. These lakes are not random accidents of geography. They are the direct result of the glaciers that once covered the region. As the ice melted, chunks of it broke off and were buried beneath layers of sediment. When those buried blocks of ice eventually melted, they left behind deep basins that filled with water. These became the lakes that now dot the Minnesota landscape. Some lakes are small and quiet, hidden among forests. Others are vast inland seas, like Lake Mille Lacs or Lake Minnetonka. But all of them share the same ancient origin. They are scars left by the retreat of the Ice Age glaciers. The glaciers also shaped the rivers of Minnesota, including one of the most famous rivers in North America, the Mississippi. Today, the Mississippi River flows more than 2,000 miles from northern Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. Yet, its beginnings are surprisingly modest. The river starts at Lake Itasca, a small lake in northern Minnesota surrounded by forests and wetlands. From that quiet beginning, a narrow stream begins its long journey southward. The path of the Mississippi was partly determined by the same forces that carved Minnesota's lakes. As the glaciers melted, water rushed across the newly exposed land, cutting channels through the soft sediment left behind by the ice. Over time, these channels deepened into rivers. Another powerful river once flowed through the region as well, a massive torrent created by melting glacial lakes. Known as the River Warren, it carried enormous volumes of water across southern Minnesota roughly 11,000 years ago. This river was far larger than the modern Minnesota River that occupies its valley today. The River Warren carved a broad, dramatic valley that remains one of the most striking features of the landscape. By the time the last glaciers disappeared, Minnesota had taken on the general shape we recognize today. The land was a patchwork of lakes, rivers, forests, and open plains. Wildlife began to spread across the region. Mammoths, mastodons, giant bison, and other animals that roamed the cold grasslands of the late Ice Age. And eventually, humans arrived. The first people to enter the region came near the end of the Ice Age, likely around 12,000 years ago. These early inhabitants were part of a wave of migration that had spread across North America after humans crossed from Asia into Alaska thousands of years earlier. As the glaciers retreated and new lands became habitable, small groups of hunters began to explore the northern interior of the continent. These earliest Minnesotans were skilled hunters who followed the movements of large animals across the open tundra-like landscape. Archaeologists refer to them as Paleo-Indians. They traveled in small bands, carrying stone tools and weapons carefully crafted from flint and other materials. Evidence of their presence in Minnesota is rare but significant. Stone spear points and other artifacts have been discovered in various parts of the state, suggesting that these early people hunted giant Ice Age animals such as mammoths and ancient bison. Life was difficult and uncertain. The climate was still cold, the seasons were harsh, and survival depended on constant movement in search of food. Over time, as the climate continued to warm, the environment began to change. The great Ice Age animals gradually disappeared, and forests began to spread across the landscape. Lakes and wetlands filled with fish and waterfowl. New plant species appeared, providing fresh sources of food. Human communities adapted to these changes. Instead of focusing only on large game hunting, people began to gather plants, fish in the lakes and rivers, and hunt smaller animals in the growing forests. Their camps moved with the seasons as they followed resources across the landscape. The land that had once been dominated by glaciers slowly became a place where human life could flourish. For thousands of years, these early cultures would continue to evolve, developing new tools, traditions, and ways of living in the northern forests and plains. Long before Europeans ever dreamed of the Mississippi River, long before maps showed the outline of Minnesota, generations of people had already begun to build their lives in this landscape shaped by ice. The story of Minnesota, therefore, begins not with explorers or settlers, but with the slow creation of the land itself. A land carved by glaciers, filled with lakes, and open to the first human footsteps as the Ice Age came to an end. And as the climate warmed and the forests spread across the region, new cultures would rise from these ancient beginnings. In time, powerful indigenous nations would come to dominate the land, shaping its history long before the arrival of Europeans. Chapter 2. The First Peoples of the North. As the great glaciers disappeared and the land that would one day be called Minnesota began to warm, a new chapter in the region's history unfolded. The lakes filled with water, forests spread across the land, and animals returned to the northern plains. Into this changing world came the first enduring human cultures of the region, the earliest peoples of the North. These first inhabitants had already begun arriving toward the end of the Ice Age. Archaeologists call them the Paleo-Indians, and they represent the earliest known human presence in Minnesota. They were hunters who moved across vast distances, following the great herds of animals that roamed the continent at the time. The landscape they entered looked very different from the Minnesota we know today. Much of the region was still open grassland or tundra-like terrain, dotted with newly formed lakes and wetlands left behind by retreating glaciers. Life for these early people depended on mobility. Small groups traveled across the land carrying only what they could transport. Their survival relied on carefully crafted stone tools, especially spear points designed for hunting large animals. These spear points, often made from flint or other durable stone, are among the most important clues archaeologists have discovered about the Paleo-Indians of Minnesota. The animals they hunted were enormous by modern standards. Herds of ancient bison moved across the plains, while mammoths and mastodons, relatives of modern elephants, roamed the landscape. Hunting such creatures required skill, cooperation, and careful planning. Groups of hunters would work together to track animals across long distances before attempting the dangerous task of bringing them down with spears. Over time, however, the world around them began to change. As the climate continued to warm after the Ice Age, many of the large animals that had dominated the continent began to disappear. Some went extinct, while others retreated northward into colder regions. Forests spread across the land that had once been open grassland. Lakes and rivers became more stable, and new plant species flourished in the changing climate. Human societies had to adapt to this new environment. This transition gave rise to what archaeologists call the Archaic period, a long era that lasted several thousand years. During this time, the people living in the Minnesota region began to develop new ways of surviving in the forests and wetlands that now covered much of the landscape. Instead of relying primarily on hunting large animals, archaic peoples expanded their diets. They hunted deer, elk, and smaller game. They fished in the lakes and rivers that were now abundant across the region. They gathered wild plants, berries, nuts, and seeds, taking advantage of the rich natural resources the forests provided. Their tools also became more diverse. Archaeological discoveries from this period include fishing hooks, axes, grinding stones, and other implements designed for processing plant foods and building shelters. These innovations allowed people to live more efficiently within the new environment. Although archaic communities still moved with the seasons, they began to return to certain places year after year. Camps were often located near rivers, lakes, or other reliable sources of food. Over generations, these recurring gathering places became important centers of social and economic life. One of the most significant developments during this time was the emergence of early trade networks. Even thousands of years ago, people living in the Minnesota region were connected to communities far beyond their immediate surroundings. Archaeologists have found evidence of materials that originated hundreds of miles away. Copper from the Lake Superior region, for example, was shaped into tools and ornaments. Certain types of stone used for making spear points came from distant quarries. These discoveries suggest that early peoples of the North were part of a growing network of exchange. Goods, ideas, and cultural practices traveled between different groups across vast areas of North America. Over time, these networks helped lay the foundation for a new cultural era in the region, the Woodland period. Beginning roughly 2,000 years ago, societies across the upper Midwest began to change in important ways. Communities became more settled, and new traditions appeared that would leave a lasting mark on the landscape of Minnesota. One of the most striking developments of the woodland cultures was the construction of burial mounds. These earthen structures were built by carefully piling soil into raised shapes that marked burial sites or ceremonial spaces. Some mounds were simple, while others were large and complex, sometimes arranged in patterns or shapes across the landscape. Building such structures required coordinated labor and strong community organization. Mounds served important cultural and spiritual purposes. They were places where communities honored their dead and maintained connections with their ancestors. Over time, Mound building became a defining feature of many woodland societies throughout the upper Midwest. Minnesota was home to numerous mound-building communities. Many of their earthworks once stood along rivers and near lakes, though some have disappeared over time due to development. The surviving sites remain powerful reminders that complex societies existed in the region long before European arrival. The woodland period also saw the expansion of long-distance trade networks that connected Minnesota to much of eastern North America. Artifacts discovered in the region show evidence of trade with distant cultures. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico, exotic stones from the Great Plains, and other rare materials have been found in archaeological sites across the upper Midwest. These items were often used to create ornaments, ceremonial objects, and tools. Such trade suggests that the people of Minnesota were part of a vast cultural network stretching across the continent. In addition to trade and mound building, woodland cultures also began experimenting with early forms of agriculture. While hunting, fishing, and gathering remained central to survival, some communities cultivated plants such as squash and other native crops. This gradual shift toward plant cultivation allowed certain groups to remain in one place for longer periods of time. Village life slowly began to emerge. Communities developed seasonal settlements where families lived together for part of the year before moving to hunting or gathering grounds as needed. These villages became centers of social life, where stories, traditions, and cultural knowledge were passed down through generations. For thousands of years, the people of the Minnesota region adapted to the forests, lakes, and rivers that defined their homeland. Their societies grew more complex, their trade networks expanded, and their cultural traditions became deeply rooted in the land. By the time the woodland cultures flourished across the upper Midwest, Minnesota was no longer simply a landscape shaped by glaciers. It had become a homeland, one filled with communities, traditions, and networks that connected its people to a much larger world. In the centuries that followed, new nations would rise within this landscape. Among them were two powerful indigenous peoples whose rivalry and interactions would shape the region for generations: the Dakota and the Ojibwe. Their arrival would mark the beginning of a new and dramatic chapter in the history of the North. Chapter 3: The Rise of the Dakota and Ojibwe. As the centuries passed after the woodland cultures flourished across the lakes and forests of the upper Midwest, the human story of the region continued to evolve. Communities grew, traditions deepened, and new peoples rose to prominence across the land that would one day be called Minnesota. Among the most influential were two great indigenous nations whose histories would shape the region for generations: the Dakota and the Ojibwe. Long before Europeans ever reached the northern interior of North America, the Dakota people had already established themselves across much of the territory that included present-day Minnesota. The Dakota were part of a larger cultural and linguistic group known as the Sioux. Their ancestors had moved across the continent over many centuries, eventually settling in the vast region of forests, lakes, and prairies that stretched across the upper Mississippi Valley. For the Dakota, the land was not simply a place to live. It was a living world filled with meaning, memory, and spiritual power. Rivers, lakes, animals, and forests were a part of a larger spiritual universe that connected all living things. Their worldview centered on a deep respect for the balance of nature and the belief that humans existed within a sacred relationship with the earth. The Dakota organized their lives around the changing seasons. In the warmer months, families often gathered in larger communities near rivers and lakes, where fish, wild plants, and game animals were abundant. During the colder seasons, smaller groups moved across the land to hunt deer, elk, and other animals. These seasonal migrations allowed them to make use of the region's rich but shifting resources. Hunting played a central role in Dakota life. Skilled hunters tracked animals across forests and prairies using bows, arrows, and carefully crafted tools. But hunting was never simply about survival. Ceremonies and spiritual practices surrounded many aspects of daily life. Rituals honored the animals that provided food, clothing, and tools. Elders passed down stories that explained the origins of the world and the responsibilities humans carried toward the natural world. Community life was built around extended families and clans. Leadership was not based solely on power, but on respect and wisdom. Leaders were expected to guide their people through difficult decisions, maintain peace when possible, and ensure that traditions were preserved for future generations. For centuries, the Dakota lived across much of what is now Minnesota and the surrounding regions. Their villages dotted the river valleys, and their hunting territories extended across wide stretches of prairie and forest. Trade connected them with other indigenous groups throughout the continent. Materials such as copper, stone, and decorative items traveled through networks that linked distant communities. But the Dakota were not alone in the northern forests. Far to the east, another powerful people were beginning a long migration that would eventually bring them into the Minnesota region. These were the Ojibwe, also known as the Chippewa. Their ancestors had lived for generations near the eastern Great Lakes, particularly around what is now Ontario and Michigan. According to Ojibwe oral traditions, their people began a great migration westward guided by spiritual visions. These stories speak of a sacred journey in which the Ojibwe followed signs from the spirit world that led them toward a place where food grows on water. This phrase referred to wild rice, a plant that thrived in the lakes and wetlands of the upper Midwest and would become a central element of Ojibwe life. Over generations, Ojibwe communities gradually moved westward along the Great Lakes. By the late centuries before European contact, many had reached the forests and lakes of northern Minnesota. Like the Dakota, the Ojibwe lived in close relationship with the natural environment. Their communities also followed seasonal cycles that guided when and where people traveled throughout the year. Spring and summer often brought fishing and gathering along rivers and lakes. Autumn was the season of wild rice harvesting, when families gathered in canoes to collect the valuable grain from marshy lakes. Winter was devoted largely to hunting, when smaller groups moved into the forests to track deer and other animals. Wild rice was particularly important to Ojibwe culture. Harvesting the rice required careful knowledge of the lakes and wetlands where it grew. Canoes glided through the shallow waters, while gatherers gently knocked the grains into baskets using wooden sticks. The rice was then dried, roasted, and stored for the winter months. It provided a reliable source of food and became deeply woven into Ojibwe traditions and ceremonies. Ojibwe spiritual beliefs were rich and complex, centered around a world alive with spiritual forces. Many traditions focused on maintaining harmony between humans and the spirit world. Ceremonies, songs, and sacred stories played an important role in preserving this balance. Knowledge keepers and spiritual leaders guided communities through rituals that strengthened their connection to both ancestors and the natural world. As Ojibwe communities expanded into northern Minnesota, their presence gradually brought them into contact with the Dakota. At first, these encounters likely involved trade and cautious interaction. Both nations were skilled hunters, fishers, and traders who understood the value of exchange. But over time, competition for territory and resources began to shape relations between them. The forests and lakes of Minnesota were rich, but they were not limitless. Hunting grounds, fishing waters, and wild rice lakes were essential to survival. As Ojibwe communities continued to move westward, they entered lands that the Dakota had long considered part of their own territory. This created a rivalry that would influence the region for generations. Conflicts between the Dakota and Ojibwe were not constant wars, but they formed a recurring pattern of tension, raids, and shifting boundaries. Alliances and rivalries could change over time, yet the competition between the two nations became one of the defining features of life in the region. Despite these struggles, both peoples developed strong societies deeply rooted in the landscape. Their villages, hunting territories, and trade networks stretched across the forests, rivers, and plains. Knowledge of the land, its seasons, animals, plants, and waterways was passed down through generations. By the time Europeans first began exploring the interior of North America in the 17th century, Minnesota was already a homeland shaped by these powerful indigenous nations. The Dakota and the Ojibwe had built cultures rich in tradition, spirituality, and knowledge of the natural world. The arrival of Europeans would soon bring dramatic change. New trade opportunities would appear, but so would new conflicts and new alliances. Explorers, missionaries, and traders from distant continents would enter the region, drawn by the promise of wealth hidden in the forests of the north. And with their arrival, Minnesota would become part of a much larger story unfolding across the continent. Chapter 4: French Explorers and the Gateway to the West. By the time the first Europeans began pushing into the northern interior of North America, the land that would one day become Minnesota was already home to powerful indigenous nations. The Dakota and the Ojibwe controlled vast territories across forests, rivers, and lakes, and their societies were deeply connected to the land. For generations they had hunted, traded, and traveled through the waterways that crisscrossed the region. Yet beyond the horizon, a new force was moving slowly westward across the continent. European explorers driven by curiosity, ambition, and the promise of wealth. The first Europeans to enter the broader region were French. In the 17th century, France controlled a massive colonial empire in North America known as New France. From the settlements along the St. Lawrence River in present-day Canada, French traders and explorers began moving deeper into the continent's interior. Their goal was not simply land or conquest. What drew them westward was one of the most valuable commodities of the time: animal fur. In Europe, beaver fur was highly prized for making felt hats, which were fashionable and widely worn. The demand for beaver pelts was enormous, and the forests of North America were filled with them. French merchants quickly realized that the vast river systems of the continent could serve as highways into the interior where these furs could be obtained. Among the earliest Europeans to venture into the region were two remarkable explorers, Pierre Esprit Radisson and Médard de Groseilliers. These men were not traditional soldiers or colonial officials. They were adventurers, traders, and wanderers who traveled immense distances through the wilderness of North America. In the 1650s, they journeyed westward from the Great Lakes into lands that few Europeans had ever seen. Traveling primarily by canoe and guided by indigenous knowledge of the waterways, they explored the forests and rivers that would later become part of Minnesota. Their journeys were incredibly demanding. Canoes had to be carried across stretches of land known as portages whenever rivers were interrupted by rapids or waterfalls. Supplies were limited, weather could turn brutal, and communication with distant settlements was nearly impossible. Survival often depended on cooperation with indigenous communities who understood the land far better than the newcomers. Radisson and de Groseilliers traveled widely through the Great Lakes region and likely reached parts of the Northern Territories connected to present-day Minnesota. Their reports described vast forests, rich in animals and trade opportunities. They spoke of powerful indigenous nations, immense waterways, and landscapes that stretched seemingly without end. For French traders, these reports were electrifying. They suggested that the interior of North America held enormous economic potential. The rivers that flowed through these lands could connect distant regions into a trading network that reached from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. As exploration expanded, more French travelers pushed deeper into the continent. Among them was a Franciscan missionary, whose name would become closely tied to the early European story of Minnesota. Father Louis Hennepin. Hennepin arrived in North America in the late 17th century as part of a French expedition led by the explorer René Robert Cavelier, better known as La Salle. Their mission was ambitious. They sought to explore the Mississippi River and strengthen France's influence across the interior of the continent. In 1680, Father Hennepin traveled north along the Mississippi River into territory controlled by the Dakota. His journey took him through landscapes that few Europeans had ever witnessed. Towering forests lined the riverbanks, and the waters flowed through valleys carved long ago by glaciers. At one dramatic point along the river, Hennepin encountered a spectacular waterfall plunging into a rocky gorge. He named it the Falls of St. Anthony, after his patron saint. Today, that waterfall lies within the city of Minneapolis, though modern dams have altered its appearance. At the time, however, it was one of the most striking natural landmarks in the region. Hennepin also played a role in documenting and popularizing knowledge of the upper Mississippi River. Through his writings, European readers gained their first detailed descriptions of the northern reaches of this great river. His accounts helped shape European understanding of the geography of North America. But exploration alone was not the driving force behind these journeys. Trade was the true engine of expansion. The French quickly realized that the success of their presence in the region depended on building relationships with indigenous nations who controlled the land and its resources. Rather than attempting immediate conquest, French traders often relied on alliances. They exchanged goods such as metal tools, weapons, cloth, and other European products for valuable animal pelts. This exchange created a growing network of trade routes that spread across the interior. Canoes loaded with furs traveled along rivers and lakes toward French settlements near the Great Lakes. From there, the pelts were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to European markets. In return, European goods flowed back into the interior, gradually reshaping the economic and political balance among indigenous nations. Minnesota's rivers became critical pathways in this expanding trade system. The Mississippi River and its tributaries connected distant regions in ways that made long-distance travel possible. The waterways that indigenous peoples had used for centuries now became part of a continental trading network. French traders, often known as coureurs des bois, ventured far beyond official settlements. These independent traders lived among indigenous communities, learned local languages, and traveled enormous distances in search of valuable furs. Their presence helped spread French influence across vast regions of North America. At the same time, European arrival introduced new dynamics into the relationships between indigenous nations. Trade goods could strengthen alliances, but also intensify rivalries. Access to European weapons and tools sometimes shifted the balance of power between competing groups. Despite these changes, the French presence in the Minnesota region remained relatively small during the early years of exploration. The land was still overwhelmingly controlled by indigenous nations who understood its rivers, forests, and seasons. Yet the seeds of transformation had been planted. Explorers like Radisson, de Groseilliers, and Father Hennepin had opened the door to the interior of the continent. Their journeys revealed that the northern forests and rivers were part of a vast system connecting distant lands. The Mississippi River, whose quiet headwaters began in the lakes of Minnesota, would soon become one of the most important waterways in North America. In the years that followed, the fur trade would grow into a powerful economic empire stretching across the northern wilderness. Traders, missionaries, and adventurers would continue pushing deeper into the region, building alliances and competing for control of its resources. And as the trade expanded, Minnesota would gradually become one of the most important gateways into the vast interior of North America. Chapter 5. The Fur Trade Empire. As French explorers pushed deeper into the interior of North America during the 17th century, they quickly realized that the rivers and forests of the northern wilderness held extraordinary economic potential. The explorers who had first entered the region had mapped the waterways and reported on the abundance of animals that lived there. What followed was the rise of one of the most important economic systems in early North American history: the fur trade. At the center of this trade was a single animal, the beaver. In Europe during the 17th century, beaver fur was incredibly valuable. Beaver pelts could be turned into durable felt used to make fashionable hats that were worn by nobles, merchants, and city dwellers alike. The demand was enormous, and European beaver populations had already been heavily hunted. North America, however, offered something Europe no longer could: vast forests filled with beaver and other fur-bearing animals. The French colonies in North America quickly recognized that these furs could become the foundation of a powerful trading empire. The forests, lakes, and rivers of the region that would later become Minnesota were particularly rich in wildlife. Beaver thrived in the countless wetlands and lakes left behind by the retreat of the glaciers. Other animals such as otter, fox, mink, and muskrat also lived in abundance. These animals became the currency of an expanding trade network that connected the wilderness of the interior with the markets of Europe. Minnesota's geography made it especially important to this growing system. The region sat at the crossroads of major waterways that connected the Great Lakes to the vast river systems of the interior. Canoes could travel through chains of lakes and rivers that stretched hundreds of miles across the continent. These waterways functioned like highways, allowing traders to move goods across enormous distances with remarkable efficiency. French traders soon began traveling regularly into these northern territories. Many of them became known as coureurs des bois, a French phrase meaning runners of the woods. These men were adventurous and often independent traders who traveled far beyond the boundaries of official French settlements. They lived for months or even years in the wilderness, paddling canoes across lakes, navigating winding rivers, and carrying supplies across long portages where waterways did not connect. Life as a coureur des bois was both dangerous and demanding. The wilderness offered no guarantees of safety. Storms could overturn canoes, rivers could become impassable, and winter temperatures could plunge far below freezing. Yet the potential rewards were great. A successful trading expedition could bring back enormous quantities of valuable pelts. The success of the fur trade, however, depended heavily on alliances with indigenous nations. The Dakota, Ojibwe, and many other indigenous peoples had been hunting, trapping, and traveling through the forests of the region for generations. They possessed knowledge of the land that no European could hope to match. They knew where animals were abundant, how to navigate the waterways, and how to survive through the harsh winters of the northern forests. Rather than attempting to control the land directly, French traders often built relationships with these communities. Trade became the foundation of these relationships. Indigenous hunters trapped animals and prepared the pelts. In exchange, French traders offered goods that were highly valued: metal tools, knives, kettles, cloth, firearms, and decorative items. These goods could make daily life easier and sometimes shift the balance of power between rival groups. Over time, these exchanges formed a vast economic network stretching across the northern half of the continent. Pelts collected in the forests of Minnesota were transported by canoe along rivers that led east toward the Great Lakes. From there, they traveled to major trading centers such as Montreal. Once in these colonial cities, the furs were prepared for shipment across the Atlantic Ocean. Eventually, they would arrive in European markets where they were turned into luxury goods and sold for high prices. The profits were enormous. French merchants, colonial officials, and traders all benefited from this expanding trade system. The fur trade soon became the backbone of France's North American economy. Entire communities developed around the seasonal rhythms of trapping, trading, and transportation. Minnesota's waterways played a critical role in keeping this system alive. Rivers such as the Mississippi and the Minnesota River connected the interior forests to the Great Lakes trade routes. Canoe brigades, large groups of traders and voyageurs traveling together, regularly moved through these waterways, carrying goods and pelts. The voyageurs, many of whom were French-Canadian laborers, became famous for their endurance. They paddled heavy canoes for hours at a time and carried enormous loads of cargo across rugged portage trails. Their work allowed the fur trade network to function across immense distances. Trading posts gradually appeared at strategic points along these routes. These posts served as meeting places where traders and indigenous hunters could exchange goods. They were often simple structures built of wood, but they became important hubs of communication and commerce in the wilderness. Despite the growth of the fur trade, European influence in the Minnesota region remained limited in many ways. The land itself was still largely controlled by indigenous nations, and the success of the trade depended on maintaining cooperative relationships with them. French traders often adopted elements of indigenous culture, learning languages and customs that allowed them to operate within local societies. The fur trade therefore created a unique frontier world where cultures blended together. French traders married into indigenous communities, and families formed that shared both European and indigenous traditions. Knowledge flowed in both directions. Europeans learned how to survive in the northern wilderness, while indigenous communities gained access to new tools and trade goods. At the same time, the fur trade gradually changed the balance of power across the region. Access to European weapons and goods could strengthen certain groups while weakening others. Competition for trade partnerships sometimes intensified rivalries between indigenous nations. As the demand for pelts grew, hunting patterns also shifted, with greater pressure placed on animal populations in some areas. Even so, during the height of the French fur trade, the region remained a vast and largely untamed wilderness. For the traders who traveled through it, Minnesota was both a land of opportunity and a land of hardship. Endless forests stretched across the horizon. Lakes glittered under the northern sky. Canoes slipped quietly through mist-covered waters as voyageurs sang rhythmic songs to keep time with their paddles. Yet the dominance of the French fur trade would not last forever. Across the Atlantic, wars between European powers were reshaping the balance of colonial control in North America. The same rivers and forests that had once served French traders would soon become contested ground in a struggle between empires. And as those conflicts spread across the continent, the future of Minnesota and the entire interior of North America would begin to change once again. Chapter 6. From France to Britain to America. For nearly a century, the fur trade had tied the forests, lakes, and rivers of the Minnesota region to the distant cities of New France. Canoes loaded with pelts traveled eastward along the Great Lakes, while traders and voyageurs carried European goods deep into the interior. French influence stretched across enormous territories, even though the number of French settlers remained small. Yet the future of this northern wilderness was never determined solely in the forests and trading posts of the interior. It was shaped by struggles between powerful European empires, whose rivalries extended across oceans and continents. By the middle of the 18th century, France and Great Britain were locked in a global contest for power. Both nations claimed vast territories in North America. France controlled an immense arc of land that stretched from the St. Lawrence River down the Mississippi Valley to Louisiana. British colonies, meanwhile, lined the Atlantic coast and were rapidly expanding westward. Between them lay enormous regions of forests, rivers, and plains that were claimed by both empires and inhabited by numerous indigenous nations. Tensions over this territory eventually erupted into a massive conflict known as the 7 Years' War, beginning in 1756. The war spread across Europe, North America, and other parts of the world. In North America, the conflict became known as the French and Indian War, reflecting the alliances that formed between European powers and indigenous nations. The struggle was not only about land, but also about control of trade routes, strategic forts, and access to the rich resources of the continent. For the Minnesota region, which lay deep within the French trading network, the outcome of the war would prove decisive. French traders had long relied on alliances with indigenous nations to maintain their presence in the interior. But the war placed enormous pressure on France's colonial system. British forces gradually gained the upper hand in North America, capturing key French strongholds and cutting off supply lines that connected the interior to the Atlantic world. In 1763, the war finally came to an end with the Treaty of Paris. The treaty dramatically reshaped the political map of North America. France ceded most of its North American territories east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain. Overnight, regions that had long been part of the French colonial world, including the lands surrounding the Great Lakes and the upper Mississippi, came under British control. For the Minnesota region, this shift marked the end of French dominance. British traders quickly moved to take advantage of the fur trade networks that the French had developed. They expanded trading operations throughout the Great Lakes and the northern forests. The economic importance of the fur trade remained unchanged, but the political authority behind it had shifted from Paris to London. The British approach to the fur trade differed somewhat from that of the French. While French traders had often lived closely with indigenous communities and formed personal alliances, British trading companies tended to operate through more formal commercial structures. Large companies organized trading expeditions, established posts, and coordinated the transport of furs back to eastern markets. One of the most influential of these companies was the Northwest Company, which later became a dominant force in the northern fur trade. From bases in Montreal, traders pushed westward along the same canoe routes that French voyageurs had used for generations. Minnesota's rivers and lakes remained vital corridors linking the wilderness to the wider trading world. Yet British control of the region was not without its challenges. Indigenous nations across the Great Lakes and interior territories had their own interests and concerns about the new colonial power. Some feared that British policies might restrict trade or threaten their autonomy. In 1763, shortly after the French defeat, a widespread uprising led by the Ottawa leader Pontiac swept across the region. Although the Minnesota Territory itself was far from the main centers of the conflict, the rebellion revealed the deep tensions that existed between indigenous nations and the expanding British Empire. Despite these conflicts, the fur trade continued to flourish under British control for several decades. Meanwhile, events along the Atlantic coast were beginning to reshape the entire political future of North America. British colonies there had grown rapidly, both in population and economic power. Yet many colonists had grown increasingly frustrated with British policies, including taxes and restrictions imposed by the British government. These tensions eventually erupted into revolution. In 1775, the American Revolution began as 13 British colonies along the Atlantic coast rebelled against British rule. After years of fighting, the war ended in 1783 with the signing of another Treaty of Paris. This treaty recognized the independence of the United States and granted the new nation a vast territory stretching westward to the Mississippi River. Suddenly, the Mississippi River became the western boundary of the young United States. The Minnesota region lay just beyond that boundary, still connected to the broader fur trade networks of the North and West. While British traders continued to operate in the region for some time, the political landscape of North America was shifting once again. The final transformation came in 1803 with one of the most important land deals in American history. That year, the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France in what became known as the Louisiana Purchase. Although France had briefly regained control of the territory from Spain, Napoleon Bonaparte decided to sell the vast region to the United States rather than attempt to maintain a distant colony. The purchase doubled the size of the United States almost overnight. Included within this enormous territory were the lands west of the Mississippi River that would eventually become part of Minnesota. What had once been distant wilderness tied to French and British empires was now part of a rapidly expanding American republic. The implications of this change were enormous. American explorers, traders, and settlers would soon begin moving into the region in greater numbers. The fur trade would continue to operate, but it would increasingly become part of an American economic system rather than a European colonial one. Military posts, trading centers, and settlements would gradually appear along the rivers that had once been used only by indigenous travelers and canoe brigades. Yet for the moment, the Minnesota region remained largely a frontier world. Indigenous nations still dominated much of the land. The forests and lakes remained wild and sparsely inhabited by outsiders. But the forces of change were already gathering. The Mississippi River, once simply a pathway for traders and explorers, would soon become the central artery of American expansion into the interior. And as American influence grew along its banks, the stage was being set for the next chapter in Minnesota's history, one marked by forts, missionaries, and the first permanent American settlements in the North. Chapter 7. Fort Snelling and the First American Settlers. After the Louisiana Purchase brought vast new territories under the control of the United States in 1803, the young nation suddenly possessed lands far beyond what its leaders had ever governed before. Much of this territory remained largely unknown to American officials. The rivers, forests, and plains that stretched west of the Mississippi were home primarily to indigenous nations, whose histories in the region stretched back thousands of years. Yet American leaders believed these lands would soon become vital to the nation's future. To secure their claim and establish authority in the northern interior, the United States government began taking its first concrete steps into the region that would later become Minnesota. One of the most important of those steps was the establishment of a military outpost at the meeting point of two great rivers. In 1820, the United States Army completed construction of a large stone fortress known as Fort Snelling. The fort stood on a high bluff overlooking the place where the Mississippi River and the Minnesota River meet. This location was not chosen by accident. For centuries, the junction of these rivers had been a critical crossroads for travel and trade. Canoes moving through the waterways of the upper Midwest often passed through this point, making it one of the most strategic locations in the region. To the Dakota people, the site had long been known as Badote, a place of deep cultural and spiritual importance. For the American government, it offered a commanding position from which soldiers could watch over the surrounding territory. Fort Snelling was named after Colonel Josiah Snelling, the officer who oversaw its construction. Built from limestone quarried nearby, the fort was designed to serve both military and administrative purposes. Thick stone walls surrounded barracks, storehouses, and officers' quarters. From the bluff, soldiers could observe the movement of travelers along the rivers below. The presence of the fort marked the first permanent American military foothold in the region. Its purpose was multifaceted. The United States hoped the fort would help regulate the fur trade, prevent conflicts between traders and indigenous nations, and assert American authority in a territory that was still far removed from the centers of American power. Soldiers stationed there were responsible for maintaining order among traders and settlers who increasingly moved through the region. Life at Fort Snelling could be both isolated and demanding. Supplies often had to travel long distances by river from settlements further south. Winters in the northern wilderness were harsh, with temperatures plunging far below freezing and snow covering the landscape for months. Yet despite these challenges, the fort quickly became a center of activity. Where soldiers established a permanent presence, other groups soon followed. Fur traders, who had already been operating in the region under French and British systems, began interacting more frequently with American authorities. Some traders established posts near the fort, recognizing that the military installation would become an important hub for commerce. Canoes loaded with pelts still traveled along the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, continuing the economic traditions that had existed for generations. Missionaries also arrived. Many Christian missionaries believed that the northern frontier offered an opportunity to spread their religious teachings among indigenous communities and the growing population of settlers and traders. Mission stations began to appear near Fort Snelling, where ministers and teachers attempted to introduce new religious ideas and forms of education. Some missionaries learned local languages and attempted to build relationships with Dakota communities who lived in the surrounding region. These early missionary efforts were often complicated and difficult. Cultural differences, language barriers, and differing worldviews sometimes made communication challenging. Yet the presence of missionaries added another layer to the emerging frontier society developing around the fort. At the same time, traders and civilians began forming small communities outside the military walls. Although official settlement was initially restricted, people found ways to establish homes and businesses near the fort. Blacksmiths, craftsmen, merchants, and traders recognized that Fort Snelling created new opportunities for economic activity. Supplies needed to be produced, goods had to be transported, and travelers required places to rest and resupply. One of the earliest civilian settlements to develop nearby would eventually grow into the city of St. Paul. At first, these settlements were little more than clusters of cabins and trading posts along the riverbanks. But they represented something new in the history of the region: the beginnings of permanent American settlement. Fort Snelling also played an important role in managing relationships between the United States government and the indigenous nations of the region. The Dakota people continued to live across large portions of the surrounding territory. Their villages and hunting grounds stretched across the river valleys and prairies of southern Minnesota. The presence of an American military installation in such a central location meant that interactions between soldiers, traders, settlers, and Dakota communities became increasingly frequent. Government officials stationed at the fort often served as intermediaries in negotiations and disputes. They monitored trade agreements and attempted to enforce American policies regarding commerce and territorial control. At times, the fort was intended to prevent conflicts between settlers and indigenous communities. At other times, it served as a symbol of expanding American authority over lands that had long been indigenous homelands. Meanwhile, the rivers flowing past Fort Snelling continued to serve as the main highways of the region. Steamboats began appearing on the Mississippi River during the early 19th century, bringing supplies and travelers from further south. These vessels made transportation faster and more reliable than the canoe brigades that had dominated earlier trade routes. As river traffic increased, the strategic importance of Fort Snelling only grew. The fort soon became the central point around which American influence in the region revolved. Soldiers marched along its walls, traders negotiated deals along the riverbanks, missionaries preached in small frontier churches, and settlers slowly began building homes in the surrounding wilderness. What had once been a remote crossroads deep within indigenous lands was gradually transforming into the nucleus of a new frontier society. Yet this transformation would not occur without tension. As American settlement expanded, pressure on indigenous lands increased. Treaties, negotiations, and competing claims would soon reshape the balance of power across the region. The rivers and prairies surrounding Fort Snelling would become the focus of new political struggles over land, resources, and sovereignty. The establishment of Fort Snelling had marked the beginning of a new era in Minnesota's history. It brought the first permanent American military presence to the region and laid the foundation for settlements that would grow into towns and cities. But the changes that followed would move far beyond the walls of the fort. In the decades ahead, the United States government would negotiate treaties that dramatically altered the ownership of land across the region. Indigenous nations would face increasing pressure as settlers poured into the territory, and the struggle over land, power, and survival would soon shape one of the most dramatic and tragic chapters in Minnesota's early history. Chapter 8: Treaties, Land, and the Displacement of Native Nations. The establishment of Fort Snelling in 1820 had marked the beginning of a new American presence in the northern frontier. What had once been a distant wilderness, connected primarily through indigenous trade networks, and the fur trade was slowly becoming part of the expanding United States. Soldiers guarded the rivers, missionaries built churches and schools, and traders moved goods through the region's waterways. Yet the greatest force of change was still gathering. As the young nation grew, thousands of Americans looked westward for land, opportunity, and a new start. For those settlers to arrive, however, one fundamental question had to be answered. Who owned the land? For the Dakota and Ojibwe nations, the answer had long been clear. For generations, their people had lived across the forests, rivers, and prairies that stretched across what is now Minnesota. These lands were not simply property in the European sense. They were homelands connected to stories, traditions, and sacred places. Hunting grounds, wild rice lakes, and village sites formed part of a living cultural landscape passed down through countless generations. But the United States government saw the land differently. American leaders believed the expansion of settlement was both inevitable and necessary. Farmers, merchants, and immigrants were moving westward in increasing numbers, and the government sought ways to open new territory for them. The main tool used to achieve this goal was the treaty. Throughout the early 19th century, American officials negotiated a series of treaties with indigenous nations across the continent. In theory, these agreements were meant to create peaceful arrangements in which native nations would cede land to the United States in exchange for payments, supplies, and designated territories where they could continue to live. In practice, the results often brought enormous change and hardship for the indigenous communities involved. In Minnesota, negotiations with the Dakota and Ojibwe began in earnest during the 1830s and 1840s. American officials arrived at treaty councils accompanied by interpreters, traders, and military representatives. Indigenous leaders gathered as well, hoping to protect the future of their people while facing growing pressure from the expanding United States. One of the earliest major agreements affecting the region was the Treaty of St. Peter's in 1837. Signed with Ojibwe leaders, this treaty transferred large areas of land east of the Mississippi River to the United States. In return, the Ojibwe were promised annual payments, known as annuities, along with continued rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the ceded territory. At the time, many Ojibwe leaders believed these guarantees would allow their communities to maintain their traditional way of life, even as American influence grew. But the arrival of settlers and the changing policies of the U.S. government would soon make those promises difficult to maintain. Meanwhile, American interest in the fertile lands of southern Minnesota was increasing rapidly. The Dakota people occupied much of this territory, particularly the river valleys that were ideal for agriculture. As American settlers pushed northward along the Mississippi River, government officials sought new treaties that would open these lands for settlement. In 1851, two critical agreements were signed with Dakota leaders: the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux and the Treaty of Mendota. These treaties required the Dakota to cede millions of acres of land across southern Minnesota to the United States. In exchange, the Dakota were promised money, goods, and small reservations along the Minnesota River where they could live. For American officials, the treaties represented a major victory. Within months, the ceded land was open to settlement. Farmers, merchants, and immigrants began arriving in large numbers, eager to claim land in the fertile river valleys. New towns appeared almost overnight as wagon roads and river routes carried settlers into the region. But for the Dakota people, the consequences were devastating. The treaties had drastically reduced the lands available for hunting and traditional food gathering. Many Dakota communities were expected to transition toward farming on reservations that were far smaller than their former territories. Promised annuity payments were often delayed or mismanaged, leaving families struggling to obtain food and supplies. In some cases, traders and government agents controlled the distribution of goods promised by the treaties. Debts were deducted from payments, and corruption within the system meant that many Dakota families received far less than what had been agreed upon. Meanwhile, American settlement continued to accelerate. Steamboats brought new arrivals up the Mississippi River, and wagon trains moved across the prairies carrying families eager to build farms and towns. The population of the Minnesota Territory grew rapidly. Settlers cleared forests, plowed fields, and built communities across lands that had recently been Dakota hunting grounds. Similar pressures affected Ojibwe communities further north. Additional treaties in the 1850s required the Ojibwe to cede more territory to the United States. Reservations were established where Ojibwe communities were expected to live, though many continued to rely on hunting, fishing, and wild rice harvesting as part of their survival. Across Minnesota, the landscape was being transformed at an astonishing pace. Where canoe routes and seasonal camps had once defined the rhythm of life, new towns and farms appeared. Roads connected growing settlements, and trading centers expanded into permanent communities. The region was evolving from a frontier into an organized American territory. Yet beneath this rapid growth lay deep tensions. Many indigenous leaders had hoped treaties would allow peaceful coexistence while protecting their people's future. Instead, the agreements often resulted in shrinking territories, unreliable payments, and increasing dependence on government agents and traders. As food supplies dwindled and settlers occupied former hunting lands, frustration and hardship spread through Dakota communities along the Minnesota River. At the same time, many American settlers saw the land simply as opportunity. They believed they were participating in the expansion of a young nation, building farms and towns that would become part of the United States. These two visions of the land could not easily coexist. By the early 1860s, Minnesota had changed dramatically. What had once been a sparsely settled frontier dominated by indigenous nations had become a rapidly growing territory, filled with farms, towns, and new American institutions. But the treaties that had made this transformation possible had also created deep grievances and unresolved conflicts. For the Dakota people in particular, the promises of the treaties had often failed to materialize. Hunger, debt, and frustration grew within communities that had been pushed into smaller territories and forced to rely on a system that rarely worked in their favor. In the summer of 1862, these tensions would erupt into one of the most dramatic and tragic conflicts in Minnesota's history. What began as a dispute over survival would quickly escalate into violence that shocked the entire nation. And the events that followed would forever change the relationship between Minnesota's indigenous nations and the expanding United States. Chapter 9. Territory on the Frontier. By the middle of the 19th century, the land that would become Minnesota was changing with remarkable speed. Only a few decades earlier, Fort Snelling had stood almost alone in a vast wilderness dominated by rivers, forests, and indigenous nations. But treaties signed with the Dakota and Ojibwe had opened enormous areas of land to American settlement. Farmers, traders, missionaries, and adventurers poured into the region, transforming what had once been a distant frontier into a rapidly developing part of the United States. As the population grew, it became increasingly clear that the region needed a more formal system of government. Until the late 1840s, much of the land that is now Minnesota had been loosely governed as part of other territories, particularly the Wisconsin Territory and the Iowa Territory. These arrangements were temporary and often confusing. Settlers living along the Mississippi River wanted local laws, courts, and political representation that reflected the realities of life on the frontier. In response to these demands, the United States Congress created the Minnesota Territory in 1849. The new territory covered a vast region. Its boundaries stretched far beyond the modern state of Minnesota, including parts of what would later become North and South Dakota. At the time, the area was still sparsely populated by Americans, but settlement was expanding quickly along the major rivers. The creation of the Minnesota Territory brought the region officially under organized American governance. A territorial government was established with a governor, judges, and a legislative assembly. These officials were responsible for creating laws, organizing local governments, and guiding the development of the territory. Although Washington, D.C. still held ultimate authority, the people living in the territory now had a political structure that allowed them to shape their own communities. The territorial capital was established at St. Paul. St. Paul had begun as a small settlement near Fort Snelling, growing slowly during the early decades of American presence in the region. At first, it was little more than a trading village along the Mississippi River. But its location made it ideal as a transportation hub. Steamboats traveling up the Mississippi could reach St. Paul, bringing goods, supplies, and settlers from the southern United States. As river traffic increased, the town quickly expanded. Warehouses, shops, and hotels appeared along the riverfront to serve travelers and traders. Streets filled with wagons and horses carrying goods to and from the docks. Within a few years, St. Paul had transformed from a rough frontier settlement into a bustling center of commerce and government. Further upstream along the Mississippi, another community was beginning to grow. Near the powerful waterfall known as the Falls of St. Anthony, entrepreneurs recognized an opportunity that would soon shape the economic future of the region. The rushing water of the falls could power mills, allowing grain harvested from nearby farms to be processed into flour. Small settlements appeared around the falls as mill owners and workers moved into the area. This settlement would eventually become Minneapolis. In its early years, the community near the falls consisted of scattered buildings, mills, and simple homes built along the riverbanks. But the power of the waterfall provided a tremendous economic advantage. As agriculture expanded across the surrounding territory, the demand for mills grew rapidly. While towns like St. Paul and Minneapolis were developing along the Mississippi River, settlers were spreading across the territory in every direction. The promise of fertile farmland attracted farmers from the eastern United States and from Europe. Wagons carrying families and supplies moved across the prairies as new farms appeared along river valleys and open plains. Wooden cabins rose quickly from the ground, and small towns formed wherever groups of settlers gathered. Immigration played a major role in shaping the territory. Many newcomers came from Northern Europe, especially Germany, Sweden, and Norway. These immigrants brought with them traditions, languages, and skills that helped define the cultural identity of Minnesota for generations to come. Scandinavian farmers in particular found the climate and landscape of Minnesota somewhat familiar, resembling the northern regions of their homelands. These immigrants worked hard to establish farms and communities in the new territory. They cleared forests, planted crops, built churches, and founded schools. Towns grew around general stores, mills, and small industries that served the needs of the growing population. Life on the frontier could be difficult, especially during the long winters. But many settlers believed the opportunities outweighed the hardships. As the population increased, political discussions about the territory's future became more intense. Territories in the United States were generally seen as temporary stages in development. Once a territory reached a sufficient population and established stable institutions, it could apply for admission to the Union as a state. For many residents of Minnesota Territory, statehood became an important goal. Statehood promised several advantages. A state would have greater control over its own laws and policies. It would elect its own governor and legislature without direct federal oversight. Most importantly, it would send representatives and senators to Congress, giving the people of the region a stronger voice in national affairs. Debates over statehood then also reflected broader political tensions within the United States. During the 1850s, the nation was increasingly divided over issues such as slavery and the balance of power between free states and slave states. Every new territory seeking statehood became part of this larger political struggle. Minnesota, located far to the north, was widely expected to enter the Union as a free state, adding another voice to the growing debate over the future of the country. Within the territory itself, political leaders argued over the exact shape and boundaries of the future state. Some proposed larger borders that would include vast stretches of prairie to the west. Others favored more compact boundaries centered around the Mississippi River settlements. These debates reflected both practical concerns and political ambitions as leaders attempted to shape the future of the region. Meanwhile, life in the territory continued to move forward. Steamboats regularly traveled the Mississippi River carrying supplies and settlers. Roads and trails connected growing towns, farms expanded across the fertile land, and new businesses appeared to serve the needs of the population. Yet even as American communities flourished, tensions remained beneath the surface. The treaties that had opened much of the land for settlement had dramatically reduced the territories available to the Dakota and Ojibwe peoples. Many indigenous communities struggled with shrinking resources and unreliable treaty payments. As American settlement accelerated, these pressures intensified. By the early 1860s, Minnesota Territory had grown rapidly and was on the verge of becoming a full state in the Union. But the rapid expansion of American society had also created conditions of deep conflict. Soon, those tensions would erupt into violence that would shake the young state and leave a lasting scar on its history. Chapter 10. The Dakota War of 1862. By the early 1860s, Minnesota had transformed rapidly from a remote frontier territory into a young American state filled with farms, towns, and growing communities. Yet beneath this progress lay deep tensions that had been building for years. The treaties that had opened vast lands to American settlement had also confined the Dakota people to narrow reservations along the Minnesota River. Promises of payment, food, and supplies were meant to compensate for the loss of their homeland. In reality, those promises were often delayed, reduced, or controlled by traders and government agents. Hunger, frustration, and desperation spread through many Dakota communities. The Dakota people had once lived across much of southern Minnesota, hunting bison on the prairies and gathering food along the river valleys. After the treaties of 1851, however, they were forced onto a strip of land along the Minnesota River. The government encouraged them to adopt farming and abandon their traditional way of life. Some Dakota families attempted to farm, but poor soil, lack of supplies, and unfamiliar conditions made success difficult. Meanwhile, the game animals they had once hunted were disappearing as settlers moved into the region. Matters grew worse when annuity payments promised by treaty failed to arrive on time. These payments were supposed to provide food and resources for Dakota communities. Instead, delays and corruption within the system meant that many families faced severe shortages. Traders often demanded repayment of debts before allowing Dakota people to receive supplies. In one infamous incident, a trader reportedly remarked that if the Dakota were hungry, they should simply eat grass. By the summer of 1862, the situation had reached a breaking point. The United States was already deeply engaged in the Civil War, and federal attention was focused elsewhere. Food supplies on the Dakota reservation were dangerously low. Many families were on the edge of starvation. Anger and despair spread among young Dakota men who believed their people had been betrayed by the treaties they had signed. On August 17, 1862, a violent incident sparked the beginning of what would become known as the Dakota War of 1862. A group of Dakota hunters had an argument with settlers near the small community of Acton Township. In the confrontation that followed, 5 settlers were killed. When news of the incident reached Dakota leaders, a difficult decision had to be made. Some believed war with the United States was inevitable and urged immediate action. Others feared the consequences and argued against fighting. Among the leaders who supported resistance was Taoyataduta, often known by the name Little Crow. Little Crow understood that the Dakota were facing an impossible situation. Their land was gone, their people were hungry, and the power of the United States was immense. Yet he also knew that many of his people were desperate and angry. After intense debate, the decision was made to attack nearby settlements in hopes of driving settlers out of the Minnesota River Valley. The conflict spread quickly. Dakota warriors attacked trading posts, farms, and small settlements along the frontier. Several towns were overrun as settlers fled in panic. Hundreds of civilians were killed during the early days of the uprising, and many others were taken captive. The attack sent shockwaves through Minnesota as news of the violence spread across the state. American settlers organized militias and defensive positions, while the U.S. Army mobilized forces to confront the uprising. Battles and skirmishes took place across southern Minnesota. Some of the most significant fighting occurred at places such as New Ulm and Fort Ridgely, where settlers and soldiers fought desperately to defend their positions. In New Ulm, one of the largest towns in the region, Dakota warriors launched multiple attacks that nearly destroyed the community. Despite early successes, the Dakota faced overwhelming challenges. The United States possessed far greater military resources, and reinforcements soon arrived. Organized troops moved into the region to suppress the uprising. One of the final major confrontations occurred in September 1862 at the Battle of Wood Lake. There, U.S. forces defeated Dakota warriors, effectively ending large-scale fighting. Many Dakota leaders recognized that the war had been lost. Some groups fled westward across the plains to escape retaliation. Others surrendered to American forces, hoping to spare their families from further violence. But the consequences that followed were severe and devastating. In the weeks after the conflict ended, U.S. military authorities conducted trials for hundreds of Dakota men accused of participating in the uprising. These trials were held quickly and under chaotic conditions. Many lasted only a few minutes. Defendants often had little opportunity to present evidence or call witnesses. In total, more than 300 Dakota men were sentenced to death. The final decision, however, rested with the President of the United States. Abraham Lincoln personally reviewed the trial records. Concerned about the fairness of the proceedings, he ordered a reduction in the number of executions. Lincoln approved death sentences for 38 men who had been convicted of participating in killings during the conflict. On December 26, 1862, the executions were carried out in the town of Mankato. 38 Dakota men were hanged simultaneously on a large scaffold before a crowd of thousands. It remains the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. The aftermath of the war brought further tragedy for Dakota communities. Many Dakota families were forced into internment camps during the winter following the conflict. Conditions were harsh, and disease spread quickly among those confined. In 1863, the United States government expelled most Dakota people from Minnesota entirely. They were sent to reservations far to the west, in what are now South Dakota and Nebraska. The Dakota War of 1862 left a deep scar on Minnesota's history. For settlers, the conflict reinforced fears about frontier security and accelerated calls for stronger military control of the region. For the Dakota people, it marked the loss of their remaining homeland in Minnesota and the forced removal of their communities. Yet the memory of the war would never disappear. The events of 1862 remained one of the most tragic and defining moments in the history of the state. The conflict revealed the devastating consequences of broken promises, cultural misunderstanding, and the rapid expansion of American settlement into lands that had long been indigenous homelands. As Minnesota continued to grow after the war, new industries, railroads, and immigrant communities would shape the future of the state. But the legacy of the Dakota War would remain a powerful reminder that the transformation of the frontier came at an enormous human cost. Chapter 11. Minnesota in the Civil War. Only months after the Dakota War of 1862 had shaken Minnesota, the young state found itself deeply entangled in an even larger and more devastating conflict. Across the nation, the United States had been torn apart by the American Civil War, a struggle between the Union in the North and the Confederate States in the South. Although Minnesota lay far from the main battlefields, its citizens quickly became part of the fight to preserve the Union. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Minnesota had been a state for barely 3 years. It was still developing its towns, farms, and political institutions. Yet the news of the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter stirred strong reactions among many Minnesotans. The state had been admitted to the Union as a free state, and most of its political leaders supported the preservation of the United States. Minnesota's governor at the time, Alexander Ramsey, happened to be in Washington, D.C. when news of the attack arrived. He immediately pledged Minnesota's support to President Abraham Lincoln, offering troops to help defend the Union. In fact, Ramsey's promise was one of the first offers of military support received by the federal government. Recruitment began almost immediately. Young men from farms, towns, and frontier settlements across Minnesota volunteered to serve. Many believed they were defending not only their country, but also the future of the young state they had helped build. Others were driven by a sense of adventure or the promise of steady pay during uncertain times. Among the earliest units formed was the 1st Minnesota Infantry Regiment. The regiment consisted largely of volunteers from across the state, many of whom had little military training before joining. Farmers, laborers, immigrants, and clerks suddenly found themselves wearing Union uniforms and preparing to march into a war that few fully understood. After organizing and training, the regiment was sent east to join the Army of the Potomac, the main Union force fighting in Virginia and the surrounding regions. For the men of the 1st Minnesota, the journey was astonishing. Many had never traveled far from home before. Now they were crossing the vast distances of the country to enter a conflict that would determine the fate of the United States. Their baptism by fire came during some of the earliest major battles of the war. The regiment fought at the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861, one of the first large engagements of the Civil War. Like many Union units, they experienced the chaos and confusion of early wartime battles. The Union Army suffered defeat at Bull Run, but the experience hardened the soldiers and prepared them for the difficult campaigns ahead. Over the next 2 years, the 1st Minnesota Infantry fought in several major battles as the Union and Confederate armies clashed across the eastern United States. The soldiers endured exhausting marches, harsh weather, and the constant threat of battle. Disease spread easily through crowded camps, and many soldiers died not from combat, but from illness. Yet the regiment gained a reputation for discipline and courage as it continued to fight alongside other Union units. Their most famous and dramatic moment would come in the summer of 1863, during one of the most important battles of the entire war. In early July, Union and Confederate armies collided in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Battle of Gettysburg quickly became a massive 3-day struggle involving tens of thousands of soldiers on each side. Control of the battlefield shifted repeatedly as both armies fought fiercely for strategic positions. On the second day of the battle, July 2nd, Union forces faced a critical moment. Confederate troops launched a powerful assault against the Union center. If the Confederate advance succeeded, it could split the Union Army in two and potentially win the battle. Union commanders needed time to bring reinforcements into position, but the advancing Confederate soldiers were rapidly closing the distance. At that crucial moment, the 1st Minnesota Infantry received an extraordinary order. They were commanded to charge the advancing Confederate line. The order was almost unbelievable. The Minnesota soldiers numbered only a few hundred men, while the Confederate force they were about to attack was several times larger. Yet the regiment did not hesitate. The men fixed bayonets and moved forward into the open field. The charge that followed became one of the most legendary moments in American military history. The soldiers of the 1st Minnesota advanced directly toward the Confederate line under heavy fire. Bullets tore through their ranks as they ran forward, but the charge succeeded in its objective. Their sudden assault shocked the Confederate troops and slowed their advance long enough for Union reinforcements to arrive. The cost, however, was staggering. Within minutes, nearly the entire regiment had been cut down. Out of roughly 260 soldiers who took part in the charge, more than 200 were killed or wounded. The regiment suffered one of the highest casualty rates of any unit in the Civil War, yet their sacrifice had helped save the Union position at Gettysburg. The battle continued the following day, culminating in the famous Confederate assault known as Pickett's Charge. Union forces ultimately held their ground, and the Confederate Army was forced to retreat. Gettysburg became a turning point in the Civil War, marking the beginning of a gradual shift in momentum toward the Union. For Minnesota, the bravery of the 1st Minnesota Infantry became a source of deep pride. News of their heroic charge spread across the state. Newspapers reported the incredible sacrifice made by the regiment, and the soldiers were celebrated as symbols of courage and dedication. Their actions demonstrated that even a young and distant state could play a decisive role in the fate of the nation. Minnesota contributed thousands of soldiers to the Union war effort over the course of the Civil War. Regiments from the state fought in numerous campaigns across the country. Minnesotans served not only in infantry units, but also in cavalry, artillery, and support roles. Many never returned home, falling on distant battlefields far from the forests and prairies of their home state. The war also affected Minnesota in other ways. While soldiers fought in the eastern theaters, the state continued to recover from the Dakota War of 1862. Communities rebuilt settlements, strengthened defenses, and struggled to heal from the trauma of the conflict. For a time, Minnesota faced the extraordinary challenge of confronting both frontier violence and a national civil war. By 1865, the Civil War finally came to an end with the defeat of the Confederacy. Union victory preserved the United States and abolished slavery across the nation. For Minnesota, the war had cemented its place as a loyal part of the Union and demonstrated the commitment of its citizens to the country's survival. The state that had once been a distant frontier was now firmly connected to the broader story of the United States. In the years that followed, Minnesota would enter a new era of rapid growth. Railroads would cross the prairies, forests would be cut for lumber, and industries would rise along the powerful rivers that flowed through the land. The frontier was changing once again, and the next chapter of Minnesota's history would be shaped not by war, but by the forces of industry and expansion. Chapter 12: Railroads, Lumber, and the Rise of Industry. When the Civil War ended in 1865, Minnesota stood at the beginning of a new era. The frontier conflicts of earlier decades had gradually given way to a different kind of struggle, one driven not by armies, but by opportunity. Across the United States, the late 19th century became a period of enormous economic expansion. Railroads stretched across the continent, industries rose in growing cities, and vast natural resources were transformed into the engines of national prosperity. Minnesota would soon become one of the most dynamic regions of this transformation. The state possessed something that industrial America desperately needed: natural resources in extraordinary abundance. The forests of northern Minnesota were among the richest timber regions in the country. Towering stands of white pine covered millions of acres across the northern part of the state. Some of these trees reached heights of more than 150 feet and had grown for centuries before the arrival of large-scale logging operations. To builders in a rapidly expanding nation, these forests represented an immense supply of lumber for houses, railroads, and cities. During the decades after the Civil War, logging quickly became one of Minnesota's most important industries. Logging camps appeared deep within the northern forests. Workers known as lumberjacks spent long winters cutting down massive pine trees using axes and long cross-cut saws. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Men labored in freezing temperatures, surrounded by snow and ice, often far from towns or settlements. Once the trees were cut, the real challenge began. The logs had to be transported hundreds of miles to sawmills where they could be processed into usable lumber. In the early years, rivers served as the primary transportation system for the logging industry. During the spring thaw, when melting snow caused rivers to swell, thousands of logs were pushed into the water and floated downstream. These dramatic events became known as log drives. Teams of workers known as river drivers guided the floating timber through winding rivers towards sawmills located further south. Standing on the moving logs with long poles, they broke apart jams where timber became trapped along the riverbanks. It was dangerous work that required skill and balance, but it allowed enormous quantities of wood to move through the wilderness without the need for roads. Much of this timber eventually reached sawmills along the Mississippi River. At the same time that logging expanded in the north, another transformation was taking place in Minnesota's transportation network. The arrival of the railroad changed everything. Railroads began reaching Minnesota in the 1860s and 1870s, connecting the state to markets across the United States. Tracks stretched across the prairies and forests, linking farms, logging camps, and towns with major cities. For the first time, goods could move quickly across vast distances, regardless of rivers or seasonal weather. The railroads made Minnesota far more accessible to settlers and businesses. Farmers could now transport grain and livestock to distant markets. Lumber from the northern forests could reach construction sites across the Midwest. Manufactured goods from eastern cities could arrive quickly in frontier towns. The railroad network turned Minnesota into a critical hub in the expanding American economy. Towns often grew wherever railroad lines were built. Stations became gathering points for farmers bringing crops to market. Businesses opened nearby to serve travelers and workers. In many cases, entirely new communities appeared along the tracks. The railroads reshaped the geography of the state, linking distant regions into a unified economic system. But perhaps the most dramatic example of Minnesota's industrial growth could be seen in a city that had once been little more than a settlement beside a waterfall. Minneapolis had begun as a small community near the Falls of St. Anthony along the Mississippi River. That waterfall, which had first impressed Father Louis Hennepin 2 centuries earlier, proved to be one of the most valuable natural resources in the region. The rushing water of the falls provided immense mechanical power. During the late 19th century, entrepreneurs built mills along the riverbanks to harness that energy. At first, these mills processed lumber from the northern forests. But soon, another industry began to dominate the city's economy: flour milling. Minnesota's prairies proved ideal for growing wheat, and farmers across the region produced enormous harvests each year. Grain was transported by railroad to Minneapolis, where powerful mills ground it into flour. The combination of water power, rail connections, and nearby wheat fields created perfect conditions for large-scale milling operations. Companies such as Pillsbury and Washburn Crosby, later known as General Mills, rose to prominence during this period. Their massive mills stood along the Mississippi River, towering above the city skyline. Inside these buildings, advanced machinery processed thousands of bushels of wheat each day. Innovations in milling technology allowed Minneapolis flour to be produced efficiently and in large quantities. By the late 19th century, Minneapolis had become the flour milling capital of the world. Flour produced in the city was shipped across the United States and exported overseas. Bread baked in cities thousands of miles away often began as wheat grown on Minnesota farms and processed in Minneapolis mills. The city's economic growth was astonishing. What had once been a frontier settlement now became one of the most important industrial centers in the Midwest. The prosperity created by logging, railroads, and milling attracted even more settlers and workers to Minnesota. Immigrants from Europe arrived in large numbers seeking opportunity in the growing industries. Many found work in sawmills, factories, and railroads, while others established farms across the fertile countryside. Cities expanded rapidly as new neighborhoods appeared to house the growing population. With industry came new challenges as well. Urban areas faced issues of labor conditions, housing, and infrastructure. Workers in mills and logging camps often endured long hours and difficult environments. Yet despite these challenges, the economic momentum of the period was undeniable. Minnesota was no longer a distant frontier. The forests of the North, the farms of the prairies, and the mills of Minneapolis had become integral parts of the American industrial system. Railroads connected the state to the rest of the nation, and its resources helped fuel the growth of cities across the country. By the end of the 19th century, Minnesota had undergone a remarkable transformation. What had once been a landscape of rivers, trading posts, and frontier settlements had become a thriving center of industry and commerce. Lumber from its forests built homes and railroads across the nation. Flour from its mills fed millions of people. And as new waves of immigrants continued to arrive, bringing their cultures, languages, and traditions, Minnesota's identity as a diverse and growing state would enter yet another chapter in its evolving story. Chapter 13. Immigrants Build the North Star State. By the end of the 19th century, Minnesota had been transformed by railroads, lumber camps, flour mills, and expanding farms. The state's forests and rivers had helped fuel an industrial boom, while its fertile prairies were becoming some of the most productive farmland in the United States. But the real engine behind this transformation was not only natural resources or machinery. It was people. Hundreds of thousands of newcomers arriving from across the Atlantic Ocean, bringing with them languages, traditions, and dreams of a new life. These immigrants would help build what became known as the North Star State. During the late 19th century, Minnesota became one of the most attractive destinations for European immigrants in the United States. Land was plentiful, especially across the southern and western prairies. Railroads advertised the region heavily, promoting Minnesota as a place where hardworking families could own farmland and build stable communities. For many Europeans facing poverty, political upheaval, or limited opportunities at home, the promise of land and freedom was irresistible. Among the largest immigrant groups arriving in Minnesota were Scandinavians, particularly people from Norway and Sweden. For many Scandinavian farmers, the landscape of Minnesota felt familiar. The cold winters, forests, and lakes resembled the environments they had known in Northern Europe. Agricultural land was also far more affordable than it had become in their home countries, where population growth had made farmland scarce and expensive. Norwegian immigrants were among the earliest Scandinavian settlers in the state. Families traveled by ship across the Atlantic, then journeyed inland by rail or river to reach the upper Midwest. Many settled in rural farming communities where they established tight-knit villages built around churches, schools, and local traditions. These communities quickly became important centers of Scandinavian culture in America. Norwegian churches held services in their native language, and community gatherings often featured traditional music, foods, and celebrations carried across the ocean from their homeland. Over time, these traditions blended with American life, creating a unique cultural identity that would remain visible in Minnesota for generations. Swedish immigrants also arrived in large numbers, particularly in central Minnesota. They established farms, built towns, and contributed significantly to the agricultural development of the region. Swedish communities often maintained strong cultural ties through churches and social organizations that helped new arrivals adapt to life in the United States. Swedish-language newspapers circulated among these communities, allowing immigrants to stay connected with both their heritage and their new home. While Scandinavians were highly visible in rural areas, German immigrants were also shaping Minnesota's population in important ways. Germans had been immigrating to the United States since the early 19th century, and many were drawn to Minnesota during its period of rapid growth. Some settled on farms across the countryside. But many also moved into growing towns and cities where they became merchants, craftsmen, brewers, and professionals. German immigrants brought with them strong traditions of education, craftsmanship, and community organization. In cities like St. Paul and Minneapolis, German cultural societies, music clubs, and newspapers flourished. German language schools and churches became important institutions that helped preserve language and traditions, while new generations adapted to American life. Beer brewing, a long-standing German tradition, also became an important industry in Minnesota. Breweries established by German immigrants became successful businesses that contributed to the economy of growing urban centers. Further north, another immigrant group left its mark on Minnesota in a very different way. Finnish immigrants began arriving in significant numbers toward the end of the 19th century, particularly in the northeastern part of the state near Lake Superior. Many Finns found work in the region's mining industry, which was expanding rapidly as iron ore deposits were discovered along the Mesabi Range. Mining towns emerged quickly in this rugged northern landscape. The work was difficult and often dangerous, but it offered opportunities that were unavailable in Finland, where economic hardship and political pressures under Russian rule had made life challenging. Finnish workers brought with them strong traditions of labor organization and community cooperation. Saunas, an essential part of Finnish culture, became common features in mining towns across northern Minnesota. These steam baths provided not only relaxation after long days of labor, but also important social spaces, where workers gathered to talk, share news, and maintain connections to their heritage. While immigrants from Scandinavia, Germany, and Finland were among the most visible groups in Minnesota, they were not the only ones. Irish immigrants had already begun settling in the region earlier in the century, often working in railroads or urban trades. Eastern Europeans, including Poles and Czechs, also began arriving in increasing numbers. Each group contributed its own traditions, foods, religious practices, and languages to the evolving cultural landscape of the state. As these communities grew, they helped shape Minnesota's agriculture in profound ways. Immigrant farmers brought knowledge and techniques developed over generations in Europe. They adapted their farming practices to Minnesota's climate and soil, experimenting with crops and livestock suited to the region. Wheat farming expanded rapidly across the prairies, and later, dairy farming became a major agricultural industry. Farmsteads appeared across the countryside, often organized around family labor and strong community networks. Barns, windmills, and grain silos dotted the open fields. Rural churches and schools served as gathering places where communities maintained their cultural traditions while raising new generations of Americans. The influence of immigrants extended beyond farms and towns into the political life of Minnesota as well. Many immigrant communities believed strongly in education, civic participation, and social reform. Scandinavian political traditions, which often emphasized cooperation and democratic participation, helped shape the state's political culture. Farmers and laborers began organizing movements to address economic challenges such as railroad pricing, land policies, and working conditions. These movements eventually contributed to Minnesota's reputation as a state with strong traditions of political activism and reform. The diverse immigrant communities also created a distinctive cultural identity. Foods such as lefse, lutefisk, and various European breads became part of local traditions. Festivals celebrated heritage and seasonal cycles. Churches, schools, and community halls served as anchors for neighborhoods and towns where cultural traditions blended with American life. By the early 20th century, Minnesota had become one of the most culturally distinctive states in the United States. Its farms were cultivated by families whose ancestors had crossed oceans in search of opportunity. Its cities were filled with businesses and institutions founded by immigrants determined to build new lives. The languages spoken in homes and churches reflected a remarkable mixture of European cultures that had taken root in the northern Midwest. The immigrants who came to Minnesota did more than simply settle the land. They shaped its culture, economy, and political values. Their communities turned frontier settlements into thriving towns and cities, and their traditions became woven into the identity of the state itself. As the new century approached, Minnesota stood as a place built by many different peoples working toward a shared future. But the rapid growth of farms, factories, and cities would soon bring new challenges. Economic inequality, labor struggles, and political movements that would redefine the state once again in the turbulent decades ahead. Chapter 14. The Progressive State. As the 20th century began, Minnesota was no longer a frontier. The forests had been logged, railroads stretched across the prairies, and cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul had grown into major economic centers of the upper Midwest. Immigrant communities had built farms, businesses, and neighborhoods that shaped the state's identity. Yet, with growth came new tensions. Farmers struggled with falling crop prices and rising transportation costs. Industrial workers faced long hours and dangerous conditions. Across Minnesota, many citizens began to believe that the economic system was unfairly tilted in favor of powerful corporations and financial interests. Out of these frustrations emerged a distinctive political culture that would give Minnesota a reputation as one of the most progressive states in the country. Farmers were among the first to organize. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, agricultural communities faced difficult economic pressures. Railroads charged high rates to transport crops. Grain companies often controlled market prices, and banks sometimes imposed heavy debts on struggling farmers. Many rural families believed that powerful businesses were exploiting their labor while leaving them vulnerable to financial collapse. In response, farmers began forming alliances and political organizations aimed at protecting their interests. These movements pushed for reforms that would regulate railroad pricing, support cooperative grain marketing, and strengthen the economic power of rural communities. Cooperative organizations allowed farmers to work together to sell crops and purchase supplies, reducing dependence on large corporations. At the same time, workers in Minnesota's growing industrial cities were organizing as well. Factories, mills, and railroads provided jobs, but working conditions were often harsh. Laborers sometimes worked 10 or 12 hours a day under dangerous circumstances. Injuries were common, wages were modest, and workers had little influence over company policies. Labor unions began emerging as workers sought better conditions and fairer pay. These organizations encouraged collective bargaining, allowing workers to negotiate with employers as a unified group rather than as individuals. Strikes and protests sometimes followed when negotiations failed, drawing public attention to the challenges faced by industrial laborers. Minnesota became one of the places where the concerns of farmers and workers began to merge politically. During the early 20th century, reform-minded citizens pushed for what became known as progressive reforms. These reforms aimed to make government more responsive to ordinary people, rather than dominated by powerful business interests. Progressive leaders supported laws that regulated corporations, improved workplace safety, expanded public education, and strengthened democratic participation. Reforms such as direct election of senators, fairer tax systems, and protections for workers reflected a broader national movement known as progressivism. But Minnesota's political evolution took a particularly unique path. In the 1920s and 1930s, farmers and labor unions began working more closely together. Their shared frustrations with economic inequality and corporate power led to the creation of a new political party, the Farmer Labor Party. This party sought to represent both rural farmers and urban workers, groups that often had similar concerns despite living very different lives. The farmer labor movement advocated for stronger labor protections, public ownership of certain utilities, unemployment assistance, and expanded social welfare programs. During the difficult years of the Great Depression, these ideas gained significant support. Economic hardship swept across the country during the 1930s. Farms failed, businesses closed, and unemployment rose sharply. In Minnesota, many voters turned toward political leaders who promised bold reforms and economic relief. The Farmer Labor Party achieved remarkable success during this period. Several governors from the party were elected in Minnesota, including Floyd B. Olson, one of the most influential political figures of the era. Olson championed policies designed to protect workers, assist struggling farmers, and strengthen government support for citizens facing economic hardship. Under Olson's leadership, Minnesota became known as a laboratory for progressive policies. Programs supporting unemployment relief, public works projects, and stronger labor protections were introduced during a time when many Americans were searching for solutions to economic crisis. The state's willingness to experiment with reform helped solidify its reputation as politically innovative. The influence of progressive politics in Minnesota continued into the mid-20th century. In 1944, the Farmer Labor Party merged with the Democratic Party to create the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, often known simply as the DFL. This political alliance united progressive farmers, labor unions, and traditional Democrats under a single banner. The DFL quickly became one of the most influential political forces in the state. Many of Minnesota's most prominent political leaders emerged from this movement, including one man whose career would have a lasting impact on national politics, Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey began his political career as mayor of Minneapolis in the 1940s. Known for his passionate speeches and strong commitment to social justice, he quickly gained national attention. Humphrey believed that government had a responsibility to address inequality and protect the rights of all citizens. One of the most defining moments of his career came in 1948 at the Democratic National Convention. At that convention, Humphrey delivered a powerful speech urging the Democratic Party to embrace civil rights more strongly. He called on the nation to move beyond discrimination and ensure equal treatment under the law for all Americans. The speech helped push the Democratic Party toward stronger support for civil rights legislation. Humphrey later served as a United States Senator and eventually became Vice President of the United States under President Lyndon B. Johnson. Throughout his career, he remained a strong advocate for civil rights, social welfare programs, and democratic reform. His rise from Minnesota politics to the national stage reflected the broader influence of the state's progressive tradition. Minnesota's political culture had been shaped by farmers seeking economic fairness, workers demanding safer conditions, and immigrants bringing traditions of civic participation from their home countries. These influences combined to create a political environment where reform movements could gain traction and where leaders often spoke passionately about social responsibility. Even as political debates continued, the state developed a reputation for high voter participation and strong civic engagement. Citizens across Minnesota took pride in participating in elections, public discussions, and community organizations. The belief that government should serve the public good remained an important part of the state's identity. By the middle of the 20th century, Minnesota had established itself as a state known not only for its forests, farms, and industries, but also for its distinctive approach to politics. The progressive spirit that emerged from farmers' alliances and labor movements had shaped laws, institutions, and national leaders. It had helped create a political culture where reform, debate, and civic involvement were central to public life. Yet the challenges of the modern world were far from over. As the 20th century continued, Minnesota, like the rest of the nation, would face new questions about economic change, civil rights, urban growth, and environmental protection. The next chapters of its history would test whether the progressive ideals that had guided the state could continue to shape its future in an increasingly complex world. Chapter 15: The Iron Range and the Steel Age. As Minnesota entered the 20th century, its identity as a progressive and politically active state was already well established. Farmers organized cooperatives, labor unions grew stronger, and political leaders like Hubert Humphrey would eventually carry Minnesota's reform-minded ideas onto the national stage. Yet alongside these political developments, another powerful force was reshaping the state's economy. One rooted deep beneath the rocky hills of northern Minnesota, hidden beneath the forests of the northern wilderness, lay one of the richest mineral deposits ever discovered in North America. Iron ore had long been known to exist in the Lake Superior region. But it was during the late 19th century that explorers and prospectors began to realize the true scale of the deposits scattered across northern Minnesota. These deposits were located in a series of ridges and rocky formations known collectively as the Iron Range. Among them, the most famous and productive would become the Mesabi Range. The Mesabi Range stretched across northeastern Minnesota for more than 100 miles. Beneath its rolling hills lay vast quantities of iron ore, an essential ingredient in the production of steel. At the time, the United States was entering an era of explosive industrial growth. Cities were expanding, railroads were spreading across the continent, and factories were producing goods on an unprecedented scale. Steel was the backbone of this transformation. It was used to build railroads, bridges, skyscrapers, ships, and countless machines that powered the modern economy. The discovery of the Mesabi Range came at exactly the right moment. In the early 1890s, prospectors began uncovering enormous deposits of high-grade iron ore near the surface of the ground. Unlike some other iron deposits that required deep underground mining, much of the ore on the Mesabi Range could be extracted using open-pit mining techniques. This made mining faster, cheaper, and more efficient. Once the scale of the deposits became clear, mining companies moved quickly. Entrepreneurs and investors rushed to northern Minnesota, eager to take part in what promised to be one of the most profitable mining operations in the world. Large corporations, including companies backed by powerful industrialists such as John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, invested heavily in the region. Mining towns appeared almost overnight across the Iron Range. Places such as Hibbing, Virginia, and Eveleth grew rapidly as workers arrived from across the United States and Europe. Many immigrants, including Finns, Italians, Slavs, and Eastern Europeans, found work in the mines. These workers were drawn by the promise of steady wages and opportunity, though the work itself was often difficult and dangerous. Life on the Iron Range revolved around the mines. Gigantic machines and teams of workers carved enormous pits into the earth. Steam shovels scooped up massive quantities of iron ore, loading it into rail cars that carried the ore toward Lake Superior. The scale of these operations was unlike anything many people had ever seen before. From northern Minnesota, the iron ore traveled a remarkable journey. Trains carried the ore to ports along Lake Superior, particularly in the city of Duluth. There, the ore was loaded onto huge cargo ships known as ore boats. These vessels traveled across the Great Lakes, transporting their cargo to steel mills located in cities such as Cleveland, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. At those mills, the iron ore was transformed into steel. That steel would then be used to build railroads that crossed the continent, skyscrapers that reshaped city skylines, and ships that carried goods across the oceans. In many ways, the iron mine in northern Minnesota helped fuel the rise of modern industrial America. The importance of the Mesabi Range cannot be overstated. By the early 20th century, the region had become one of the most productive iron mining areas in the world. Millions of tons of ore were extracted each year. The United States' growing steel industry depended heavily on this supply, making Minnesota a crucial link in the chain of American industrial power. But life for the miners who made this possible was often harsh. Mining was physically demanding and sometimes dangerous work. Workers faced long hours, unstable working conditions, and the constant risk of accidents. Many miners lived in crowded company towns where housing, stores, and services were controlled by the mining companies themselves. These conditions sometimes led to labor disputes. Workers organized strikes and protests in hopes of improving wages and working conditions. Immigrant communities often played key roles in these labor movements, bringing traditions of worker organization from Europe. The Iron Range became an important center for labor activism, reflecting the broader struggles between workers and industrial corporations during the early 20th century. Despite these challenges, the mining industry continued to expand. Technological advances allowed companies to mine ore more efficiently, while growing demand for steel ensured that production remained high. Railroads, automobiles, bridges, and military equipment all required enormous amounts of steel, and the Mesabi Range remained one of the nation's most reliable sources of iron. The Iron Range also shaped the cultural identity of northern Minnesota. Communities there developed unique traditions influenced by the many immigrant groups who lived and worked in the region. Finnish saunas, Italian restaurants, and Eastern European churches became familiar features of Iron Range towns. Families built strong community networks that helped them endure the challenges of mining life. Even today, the legacy of the Iron Range remains deeply connected to Minnesota's history. The mines changed the landscape of northern Minnesota, leaving behind vast open pits and towering piles of rock. Yet they also played a central role in building the modern United States. Steel produced from Minnesota's iron helped construct cities, transportation systems, and industries that shaped the 20th century. By supplying the raw materials that powered American industry, Minnesota had once again proven itself to be a state whose influence extended far beyond its borders. As the 20th century progressed, however, the world would continue to change. New industries would emerge, cities would expand, and social movements would reshape American society. And Minnesota, built by immigrants, powered by natural resources, and guided by a strong civic spirit, would face the challenge of adapting once again to a rapidly changing modern world. Chapter 16: Depression and War. By the early 20th century, Minnesota had become a state shaped by powerful forces of industry and immigration. The iron mines of the Mesabi Range supplied steel mills across the nation, Flour from Minneapolis fed millions, and railroads tied farms and cities together into a thriving economy. Yet the prosperity of the early decades of the century would not last forever. In 1929, the United States plunged into the worst economic crisis in its history. And Minnesota, like the rest of the country, was suddenly confronted with hardship on a scale few had ever imagined. The Great Depression struck Minnesota with devastating force. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. Farmers, who had already struggled with falling crop prices throughout the 1920s, found themselves in even greater trouble as agricultural markets collapsed. Wheat prices dropped so low that many farmers could barely cover the cost of planting and harvesting their crops. Debt mounted, and thousands of families faced the possibility of losing land that had been built through generations of labor. Cities were hit just as hard. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, factories slowed production or shut down entirely. Workers who had once depended on steady wages suddenly found themselves without jobs. Lines formed outside soup kitchens and relief centers where families hoped to receive food. Many people who had once lived comfortable lives now struggled simply to survive. The Iron Range also felt the shock of the economic collapse. Demand for steel fell sharply as construction projects halted across the country. When steel production declined, iron mining slowed dramatically. Mines closed or reduced operations, leaving thousands of miners unemployed. Entire communities that depended on mining were thrown into uncertainty. For many Minnesotans, the early years of the 1930s were a time of fear and desperation. Families tightened their budgets to the bare minimum. Children sometimes left school to help support their households. In rural areas, neighbors often helped one another survive by sharing food and resources when money was scarce. Churches and local charities attempted to assist struggling families, but the scale of the crisis was overwhelming. Relief began to arrive. After Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in 1933, Roosevelt introduced a sweeping series of programs known as the New Deal, designed to provide economic recovery and support for struggling Americans. Minnesota, with its strong tradition of progressive politics and farmer labor leadership, became an important place for many of these programs to take root. Public works projects became a major part of the recovery effort. Programs such as the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps created jobs for thousands of Minnesotans. Workers built roads, bridges, schools, and public buildings that would serve communities for decades to come. Young men in the Civilian Conservation Corps planted trees, constructed parks, and improved natural areas across the state. Many of Minnesota's state parks and conservation areas today still reflect the work done by these Depression-era programs. Farmers also received assistance through federal agricultural policies aimed at stabilizing crop prices and reducing overproduction. These programs provided relief to rural communities that had been struggling for years. While recovery was slow and uneven, the New Deal helped many Minnesotans regain a measure of stability during the darkest years of the Depression. Gradually, the economy began to recover as the decade moved forward. Industries reopened, construction resumed, and unemployment slowly declined. Yet just as the nation began to climb out of economic hardship, another global crisis was unfolding overseas. In Europe and Asia, tensions between powerful nations were escalating toward war. When World War II began in 1939, the United States initially remained neutral. But the conflict expanded rapidly, and by December 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States fully into the war. Almost overnight, the nation mobilized for one of the largest military efforts in history. Minnesota quickly became part of the national war effort. Thousands of men from across the state enlisted in the armed forces. Young Minnesotans who had grown up during the Depression now found themselves serving in distant places such as Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific Islands. Soldiers from Minnesota participated in many of the major campaigns of the war, fighting alongside troops from every corner of the United States. Back home, the war transformed the economy. Factories that had once struggled during the Depression shifted into full production to support the military. Manufacturing plants in Minnesota began producing equipment, machinery, and supplies needed by American forces. Shipyards, aircraft production facilities, and ammunition plants expanded rapidly. Iron from the Mesabi Range once again became critically important. The steel produced from Minnesota ore was used to build tanks, ships, airplanes, and weapons that supported the Allied war effort. Mining operations accelerated to meet the enormous demand for materials. For communities on the Iron Range, the war brought renewed economic activity after years of hardship. Agriculture also played a vital role. Minnesota farms produced large quantities of food that were shipped to American troops and Allied nations overseas. Farmers increased production of wheat, dairy products, and other crops needed to support the wartime economy. Women across Minnesota stepped into new roles during the war. As many men left for military service, women filled positions in factories, offices, and farms. They worked in manufacturing plants, operated machinery, and contributed to industries that had previously been dominated by male workers. Their efforts helped keep the wartime economy functioning, while also changing long-standing ideas about women's roles in the workforce. Communities throughout the state participated in wartime efforts in countless ways. Citizens bought war bonds to help finance the military. Schools organized scrap drives to collect metal, rubber, and other materials that could be recycled for war production. Families planted victory gardens to supplement food supplies. The war touched nearly every household in Minnesota. Letters from soldiers were eagerly awaited by families at home. News of battles overseas filled newspapers and radio broadcasts. Communities gathered to celebrate victories and mourn the loss of neighbors who never returned from the battlefield. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world had changed dramatically. Millions of soldiers returned home to rebuild their lives. The United States emerged as one of the most powerful nations in the world, and Minnesota entered a new era of economic growth and modernization. Industries expanded, suburbs developed around growing cities, and new technologies began reshaping daily life. For many Minnesotans, the combined experiences of the Great Depression and World War II left a lasting impact. The hardships of the Depression had taught communities the importance of cooperation and public support systems. The shared effort of the war years had demonstrated the strength of a national unity and collective sacrifice. As the state moved into the post-war era, Minnesota carried forward lessons learned during those difficult decades. Lessons about resilience, community, and the ability of ordinary people to overcome extraordinary challenges. Chapter 17. The Modern Twin Cities. When World War II ended in 1945, Minnesota stood on the threshold of a new era. The hardships of the Great Depression had begun to fade, and the state's wartime industries had helped revive the economy. Soldiers returned home from battlefields across Europe and the Pacific, eager to rebuild their lives and start families. Across the United States, the post-war years became a time of rapid growth, innovation, and social change. Nowhere was this transformation more visible in Minnesota than in the regions surrounding its two largest cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. For decades, the Twin Cities had been important economic centers. Minneapolis had grown into the flour milling capital of the world, while St. Paul served as a vital transportation and commercial hub along the Mississippi River. But after the war, the scale and pace of urban development accelerated dramatically. Returning veterans helped fuel a population boom. Many soldiers took advantage of new federal programs, such as the GI Bill, which provided financial assistance for education and home loans. These programs allowed thousands of young families to buy homes, attend college, and pursue careers that might otherwise have been out of reach. As a result, the population of the Twin Cities began to expand rapidly during the late 1940s and 1950s. Housing construction surged to meet the demand. Developers built new neighborhoods across the region, filling previously open land with rows of homes designed for growing families. These developments were often located outside the crowded urban centers, giving rise to a new pattern of living that would reshape American cities. Suburban expansion. Suburbs began appearing across the Twin Cities metropolitan area. Communities such as Bloomington, Edina, and Maplewood grew quickly as families moved away from the older urban neighborhoods. These suburbs offered larger homes, quieter streets, and access to new schools and parks. The increasing availability of automobiles made commuting between suburbs and city centers easier, allowing people to live farther from their workplaces. Highways played an essential role in this transformation. During the post-war decades, the United States invested heavily in building modern highway systems. In Minnesota, new highways connected Minneapolis and St. Paul with the surrounding suburbs and rural communities. These roads allowed people and goods to move more efficiently across the growing metropolitan region. As suburbs expanded outward, the character of the Twin Cities continued to evolve. Downtown Minneapolis and St. Paul remained important business and cultural centers, but residential life increasingly shifted to the surrounding suburbs. Shopping centers, schools, and office parks appeared in areas that had once been farmland. One of the most important drivers of economic growth during this period was the rise of major corporations headquartered in Minnesota. Among the most influential was a company that began with a simple but ambitious name: the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, better known as 3M. Founded in 1902, 3M had originally focused on mining minerals used in industrial processes. Over time, however, the company reinvented itself through innovation and research. By the mid-20th century, 3M had become a leader in developing new products, ranging from adhesives and sandpaper to tape and office supplies. The company's emphasis on research and experimentation helped establish Minnesota as a center for technological innovation. Another corporate giant shaping the Twin Cities economy was General Mills. The company traced its roots back to the flour mills that had once lined the banks of the Mississippi River in Minneapolis. As the 20th century progressed, General Mills expanded far beyond flour production. It became a global food manufacturer, producing well-known brands of cereals, baking products, and packaged foods. General Mills demonstrated how Minnesota's traditional industries could evolve into modern global enterprises. In the latter half of the 20th century, another company emerged that would transform retail across the United States. Target began as a small discount retail concept created by the Dayton Company, a Minneapolis-based department store business. The idea was simple but powerful. Offer affordable products in modern stores while maintaining a sense of style and quality. The first Target store opened in 1962 in the Minneapolis suburb of Roseville. The concept quickly proved successful. Customers appreciated the combination of competitive prices and appealing store design. Over the following decades, Target expanded across the country, becoming one of the largest retail chains in the United States. With companies like 3M, General Mills, and Target leading the way, the Twin Cities became a major center of corporate leadership and innovation. Corporate headquarters attracted skilled workers, engineers, scientists, and business professionals from across the country. Universities and research institutions in the region also grew in importance, helping supply the workforce needed for expanding industries. Cultural life in the Twin Cities flourished alongside economic growth. The region developed a vibrant art scene, including theaters, museums, and music organizations. Educational institutions expanded, and the University of Minnesota became a major center for research and higher learning. Sports teams, parks, and community events helped create a strong sense of regional identity. Yet the transformation of the Twin Cities also brought new challenges. Urban neighborhoods faced pressures from highway construction and redevelopment projects that sometimes displaced long-established communities. As suburbs expanded, cities struggled with issues such as housing inequality, transportation planning, and the need to balance growth with environmental preservation. Despite these challenges, the Twin Cities continued to develop into one of the most dynamic metropolitan regions in the Midwest. The combination of strong corporate leadership, educational institutions, and cultural vitality gave Minneapolis and St. Paul a national reputation for innovation and quality of life. The metropolitan area became known not only for business success, but also for its parks, lakes, and commitment to public services. By the late 20th century, the Twin Cities had become the heart of Minnesota's modern economy. From the towering corporate headquarters of downtown Minneapolis to the growing suburbs that spread across the surrounding landscape, the region represented the continuing evolution of the state. What had once been frontier settlements beside a waterfall and a river had grown into a major urban center connected to the global economy. Yet Minnesota's story was far from finished. As the 21st century approached, new challenges and opportunities awaited the state. Issues of social change, economic innovation, and environmental responsibility would shape the future just as surely as rivers, railroads, and immigrants had shaped the past. The North Star state would once again face the task of adapting to a rapidly changing world. Chapter 18: Civil Rights and Social Change. As the Twin Cities grew into a modern metropolitan center during the mid-20th century, Minnesota found itself facing many of the same social questions that were reshaping the rest of the United States. Economic growth and suburban expansion had created new opportunities, but they had also exposed deep inequalities. Questions about race, civil rights, indigenous sovereignty, housing, education, and political power began to move to the center of public life. In the decades after World War II, Minnesota became an important stage for social change and activism. The civil rights movement that swept across the United States during the 1950s and 1960s also reached Minnesota, though its challenges often took different forms than in the South. Minnesota had long cultivated a reputation as a progressive state, and many residents believed their communities were more tolerant than other parts of the country. Yet discrimination still existed in housing, employment, and education. African American families moving into the Twin Cities often found themselves restricted to certain neighborhoods because banks and real estate agencies refused to sell homes in other areas. Jobs in many industries remained difficult for minority workers to obtain, and schools in urban neighborhoods often struggled with inequality. civil rights organizations in Minnesota began pushing for change. Groups such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, established chapters in the Twin Cities and other communities. Local activists organized campaigns to challenge discrimination in housing and employment. Community leaders worked to bring attention to the experiences of African American families who faced barriers despite the state's progressive reputation. Minnesota also became one of the earliest states to adopt strong civil rights protections. In 1967, the Minnesota Human Rights Act was passed, prohibiting discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations based on race, religion, gender, and other factors. The law became one of the most comprehensive civil rights protections in the nation at the time, reflecting the influence of activists and political leaders who believed government should actively work to ensure equality. Political figures from Minnesota played important roles in the broader national civil rights movement as well. Hubert Humphrey, who had already risen to national prominence as a United States Senator, remained a powerful advocate for civil rights legislation. His leadership helped push forward major federal laws during the 1960s, including the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Humphrey's work reflected the broader political culture of Minnesota, where progressive ideas often found strong public support. At the same time that African American civil rights activism was gaining momentum, Native American communities in Minnesota were also entering a new era of political activism. The Dakota War of 1862 and the forced removal of many Dakota people from the state had left a long and painful legacy. By the 20th century, both Dakota and Ojibwe communities were working to reclaim cultural traditions, protect treaty rights, and challenge policies that had marginalized indigenous peoples for generations. One of the most important centers of Native American activism emerged in Minneapolis during the late 1960s. Many Native Americans had moved to cities as part of federal relocation programs that encouraged indigenous people to leave reservations in search of jobs and housing. Minneapolis became home to one of the largest urban Native American populations in the country. However, many of these families faced poverty, discrimination, and lack of access to services. Out of these challenges grew a powerful movement for indigenous rights and community empowerment. Native American activists began organizing to demand better housing, educational opportunities, health care, and recognition of treaty rights. One of the most influential organizations to emerge during this period was the American Indian Movement, commonly known as AEM. Founded in Minneapolis in 1968, AEM began as a grassroots effort to address issues facing Native Americans in urban communities. Activists organized patrols to monitor police treatment of indigenous residents and advocated for reforms in housing, education, and legal systems. AIM soon became a national force in indigenous activism. The movement organized protests and demonstrations that brought attention to long-standing injustices faced by Native American communities across the United States. While many of AIM's most famous protests occurred outside Minnesota, the organization's roots in Minneapolis made the city an important center for indigenous political organizing. Native activism in Minnesota also helped strengthen cultural revival. Communities worked to preserve traditional languages, ceremonies, and teachings that had been suppressed for generations. Cultural centers, educational programs, and tribal governments played key roles in reconnecting younger generations with their heritage. Meanwhile, the Twin Cities themselves were experiencing profound social changes. As suburbs continued to expand during the post-war decades, urban neighborhoods underwent significant transformations. Many middle-class families moved to suburban communities, leaving older city neighborhoods facing economic challenges. At the same time, New immigrant groups and minority populations were moving into urban areas, creating more diverse communities. These shifts sometimes brought tensions, but also sparked new forms of political engagement. Community organizations formed to address issues such as housing discrimination, school funding, and neighborhood development. Activists worked to ensure that urban residents had a voice in decisions affecting their communities. Urban political leadership began to reflect these changes. City governments in Minneapolis and St. Paul increasingly focused on issues such as affordable housing, civil rights protections, and public services. Political leaders worked with community groups to address inequality while trying to guide cities through the challenges of growth and change. Universities and student organizations also played a role in the broader wave of social activism. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, college campuses across Minnesota became centers of debate and protest around issues such as civil rights, the Vietnam War, and social justice. Students organized demonstrations and discussions that reflected the broader national movement for change. These years were often turbulent, but also deeply transformative. Minnesota's reputation as a progressive state did not mean it avoided conflict or controversy. Instead, the state became a place where difficult conversations about justice, equality, and representation unfolded in public view. Activists, political leaders, and ordinary citizens all contributed to shaping the direction of these debates. By the end of the 20th century, many of the movements that had begun during the Civil Rights era had reshaped Minnesota's social landscape. Legal protections against discrimination were stronger. Indigenous communities had gained greater recognition of their rights and cultures. Urban politics had become more inclusive as new voices entered public life. The process of social change, however, was far from complete. The questions raised during the Civil Rights era about equality, opportunity, and the meaning of justice continued to influence Minnesota's politics and communities. As the state moved into the 21st century, those same questions would reappear in new forms, reminding Minnesotans that the pursuit of a more just society is never truly finished. Chapter 19. The State of Lakes, Nature, and Identity. Long before cities rose along the Mississippi River or railroads crossed the prairies, the land that would become Minnesota was defined by its natural beauty. Glaciers had carved thousands of lakes into the landscape. Rivers wound through forests and plains, and vast stretches of wilderness shaped the rhythm of life for the people who lived there. Even as Minnesota grew into a modern state filled with industries, highways, and suburbs, its identity remained closely tied to the natural world. Over time, lakes, forests, and outdoor life became more than geographic features. They became central to the culture, economy, and pride of the North Star State. The nickname most commonly associated with Minnesota reflects this connection to nature. It is often called the Land of 10,000 Lakes, though the actual number is even higher. More than 11,000 lakes scatter across the state, ranging from small, quiet ponds hidden in forests to vast inland waters that stretch to the horizon. For generations, these lakes have shaped the way Minnesotans live, work, and relax. Water has always been central to life in Minnesota. Long before European settlement, indigenous nations relied on the lakes and rivers for transportation, food, and spiritual connection. Canoe routes linked communities across vast distances, while fishing and wild rice harvesting provided essential nourishment. The relationship between people and water was built on respect and balance with the natural world. As settlers arrived and towns grew, lakes continued to influence daily life. Many early communities formed near rivers and lakes because water provided transportation routes, drinking supplies, and power for mills. Even as railroads and highways eventually replaced waterways as primary transportation systems, the presence of lakes remained one of the defining features of the landscape. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Minnesota's natural beauty began attracting visitors from beyond the state. Tourism slowly developed as travelers discovered the region's forests, lakes, and fresh northern air. City residents from Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, and other urban centers began traveling north during the summer months to escape heat and crowded streets. Cabins appeared along lake shores, often simple wooden structures built for seasonal retreats. Families spent weeks or months fishing, swimming, and enjoying outdoor recreation. These summer cabins became a beloved tradition that many Minnesotans continue today. Generations of families return each year to the same lakes where grandparents and great-grandparents once spent their vacations. Fishing became one of the most popular activities associated with Minnesota's outdoor culture. The state's lakes and rivers are home to a wide variety of fish, including walleye, northern pike, bass, and trout. Walleye in particular became closely associated with Minnesota, eventually being named the official state fish. Fishing trips became part of family traditions, with early mornings on quiet lakes becoming familiar experiences for countless Minnesotans. Boating and canoeing also became defining features of life in the state. The countless interconnected lakes and rivers created endless opportunities for exploration. Canoes, once used primarily by indigenous travelers and fur traders, became popular recreational vessels. Paddling through calm waters surrounded by forests offered a peaceful connection with nature that many people found irresistible. Perhaps the most famous wilderness area in Minnesota is the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. Located in the northeastern corner of the state near the Canadian border, this vast protected region contains more than 1,000 lakes connected by narrow waterways and portage trails. Visitors travel through the area by canoe, carrying their boats across short land routes between lakes, just as indigenous peoples and fur traders did centuries earlier. The Boundary Waters represents one of the most pristine wilderness areas in the United States. Its quiet forests, clear waters, and star-filled night skies offer an experience of nature that feels largely untouched by modern development. Protecting this unique environment has become a central part of Minnesota's conservation efforts. The growth of outdoor recreation also encouraged the development of conservation programs. During the early 20th century, many Americans began recognizing the importance of protecting natural landscapes from overdevelopment and environmental damage. Minnesota became part of this broader conservation movement. State parks were established to preserve scenic landscapes and provide public access to nature. Places such as Itasca State Park, home to the headwaters of the Mississippi River, allowed visitors to explore forests, lakes, and historic sites, while protecting the natural environment for future generations. Trails, campgrounds, and educational programs helped people experience the outdoors while learning about the state's natural history. Forests also played an important role in shaping Minnesota's environmental identity. While early logging operations had removed many of the original pine forests during the 19th century, conservation efforts helped restore and protect large areas of woodland. National forests, such as the Superior National Forest, now preserve millions of acres of northern wilderness. Hunting, hiking, camping, and wildlife observation became popular outdoor activities across these forests. Deer, moose, wolves, and countless bird species inhabit the state's diverse ecosystems. For many Minnesotans, Spending time outdoors is not simply a recreational activity, but a deeply valued part of life. Winter, often seen as a challenge in colder climates, became another defining feature of Minnesota's outdoor identity. Instead of retreating indoors, many residents embraced winter sports such as cross-country skiing, ice fishing, snowmobiling, and skating. Frozen lakes transformed into gathering places where families set up fishing houses and spent long hours on the ice waiting for a catch. These seasonal activities strengthened the connection between Minnesotans and their environment. The natural landscape also became an important source of state pride. Images of lakes, forests, and northern wildlife appeared in tourism campaigns and cultural symbols. Minnesota's identity as a place of natural beauty became something residents proudly shared with visitors from around the country. Outdoor traditions helped create a shared cultural experience across different communities. Whether fishing at dawn on a quiet lake, hiking through autumn forests, or skating across frozen ponds in winter, generations of Minnesotans found common ground in their appreciation of the natural world. In many ways, the environment helped unite the state's diverse population. Immigrants from Europe, indigenous communities, and families who had lived in the region for generations all developed relationships with the land that surrounded them. The lakes and forests became a shared heritage that connected past and present. As Minnesota moved further into the modern era, the importance of protecting these natural resources remained a central concern. Environmental challenges such as pollution, climate change, and development pressures raised new questions about how best to preserve the landscapes that define the state's identity. Conservation efforts continued to evolve as citizens, scientists, and policymakers worked together to protect Minnesota's natural treasures. Yet despite these challenges, one thing remained clear. From its glacial lakes to its northern forests, the natural world continued to shape Minnesota's character. The landscapes created thousands of years ago by ice and water still influenced how people lived, worked, and celebrated life in the North Star State. And as the 21st century unfolded, Minnesotans would continue to balance the demands of modern life with their deep and enduring connection to the land that made their state unique. Chapter 20. Minnesota Today. As the 20th century drew to a close, Minnesota stood as a state shaped by centuries of transformation. From glacial landscapes and indigenous homelands to frontier settlements, booming industries, and waves of immigration, the North Star State had evolved through countless chapters of change. Entering the 21st century, Minnesota carried forward this long history while confronting the opportunities and challenges of a rapidly changing modern world. One of the defining characteristics of modern Minnesota is its strong and diverse economy. The industries that once powered the state, lumber, flour milling, and iron mining, still exist in some form. But the economy has expanded far beyond those early foundations. Today, Minnesota is home to a wide range of industries, including healthcare, technology, finance, retail, manufacturing, and agriculture. Many of the major corporations that helped shape the Twin Cities during the 20th century remain central to the state's economic life. Companies such as 3M, General Mills, and Target continue to operate on a global scale, employing thousands of workers and influencing markets far beyond Minnesota's borders. These corporations have helped make the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area one of the most important business centers in the Midwest. At the same time, new industries have emerged. Technology companies, medical research institutions, and innovative startups have found fertile ground in Minnesota's educated workforce and strong university system. The University of Minnesota plays a major role in research and development, particularly in fields such as medicine, engineering, and environmental science. Healthcare has also become a cornerstone of the state's economy. Minnesota is home to world-renowned medical institutions such as the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. Founded in the 19th century, the Mayo Clinic has grown into one of the most respected medical centers in the world, attracting patients and researchers from across the globe. Agriculture continues to remain an essential part of the state's identity and economy as well. Minnesota farms produce a wide range of crops, including corn, soybeans, wheat, and sugar beets. Livestock and dairy farming remain important industries, and modern agricultural technology has allowed farmers to increase productivity while adapting to changing environmental conditions. Politically, Minnesota has long been known for its active civic culture and high voter participation. Elections in the state consistently draw large numbers of voters, reflecting a tradition of civic engagement that dates back to the progressive movements of the early 20th century. The Democratic Farmer-Labor Party remains one of the dominant political forces in the state. Though Minnesota's political landscape includes a variety of viewpoints and debates that reflect the diversity of its population. Nationally, Minnesota often attracts attention during presidential elections because of its history of political independence and close contests. While the state has frequently supported Democratic candidates in recent decades, political discussions remain vibrant and competitive. Social and cultural diversity has also grown significantly in modern Minnesota. While earlier waves of immigrants from Scandinavia and Germany shaped much of the state's early culture, the 21st century has brought new communities from around the world. Immigrants from Southeast Asia, East Africa, Latin America, and other regions have added new languages, traditions, and perspectives to Minnesota's cities and towns. One of the most visible communities is the Somali population in Minneapolis and surrounding areas. Beginning in the 1990s, Somali refugees fleeing civil war in their homeland began settling in Minnesota. Over time, the state became home to the largest Somali population in the United States. Somali businesses, restaurants, cultural organizations, and community leaders have become an important part of the social fabric of the Twin Cities. Other immigrant groups, including Hmong communities from Southeast Asia, have also established vibrant cultural traditions throughout the state. These communities have contributed to Minnesota's cuisine, arts, business environment, and political life. Cultural festivals, markets, and community centers celebrate the diverse heritage that now defines modern Minnesota. The state's cultural life continues to flourish as well. The Twin Cities are known for their thriving arts scene, including theaters, music venues, museums, and literary organizations. Minneapolis is home to one of the nation's most active theater communities outside of New York City. Music has also played an important role in the state's cultural identity, with artists such as Prince bringing international attention to Minnesota's creative talent. Sports remain a major part of community life. Professional teams such as the Minnesota Vikings, Twins, Timberwolves, Wild, and Minnesota United draw passionate support from fans across the state. College athletics, particularly at the University of Minnesota, also bring communities together. Meanwhile, Minnesota's deep connection to nature continues to shape how people experience the state. The lakes, forests, and parks that have defined Minnesota for generations remain central to everyday life. Outdoor activities such as fishing, boating, hiking, and winter sports continue to be popular pastimes. Conservation efforts remain strong as residents work to protect the natural landscapes that form such a vital part of the state's identity. In recent decades, Minnesota has also faced new social challenges that reflect broader national issues. Discussions around racial justice, economic inequality, environmental protection, and urban development have become important topics in public life. Events in the early 21st century sparked national conversations about policing, community relations, and the pursuit of justice. These discussions have encouraged many Minnesotans to reflect on their state's history while seeking ways to build a more inclusive future. Through these conversations, Minnesota continues to evolve. Cities are growing, new industries are emerging, and communities are adapting to the demands of a global economy. At the same time, traditions rooted in the state's long history, from indigenous cultures to immigrant heritage and environmental stewardship, remain powerful influences on daily life. Looking across the centuries, the story of Minnesota reveals a place shaped by both resilience and reinvention. Glaciers carved its lakes thousands of years ago. Indigenous nations built rich cultures along its rivers. Explorers and traders opened paths through its wilderness. Immigrants built farms, industries, and cities. Political reformers shaped its civic identity, and generations of citizens contributed to its cultural and economic vitality. Today, the North Star State stands as a modern and dynamic part of the United States, guided by the same spirit of community, curiosity, and determination that has defined its history from the very beginning. And as new chapters continue to unfold, Minnesota remains a place where past and future meet. Under the same northern sky that once guided travelers across its lakes and forests. Following the steady light of the North Star,